Hi everyone. Good to see you on my channel today. Today I will tell you a wonderful story. It is full of love and kindness. I hope you enjoy it and I wish you an enjoyable viewing experience. Thank you.
How sick? What about the cargo? We've already been paid in advance, Scott. Mr. Harry was indignant. He'd been a trucker for years before he started his own trucking company. Bought a car, then 2 more. That's how the business got going. The drivers always went on a trip 2 by 2, if it was necessary to go far. You never know what might happen on the road. I found myself in a situation where I could howl like a wolf. The engine stalled, and there was not a soul on the motorway, and it was cold, and the water ran out. Remembering his past experience of working on lorries, Harry sometimes smiled. There was a charm in it, the night, the road, the radio, and it felt so good, so bright. At home, his wife and little daughter were waiting for him. Her character was explosive, so business trips were a kind of an outlet for Harry. Well, he fell in love with her, and now he had a child to take care of. Temperature, Mr. Harry. This new virus has got to us. My son brought a similar one home from daycare. But if you really need it, I'll pop some pills and take it to you. I'll go alone so my partner doesn't get the same. It's the season. Everyone's sick. Harry glanced out the window. November was snowing and raining. And what else? If you're going to lie down, all right, you just get better. The customer promised more orders for this week. So you better get better. And the load? Asked the driver. I'll carry it myself, I guess. I've got my arms and legs. My license hasn't been taken away yet. Harry smiled. He hadn't traveled for a few years either, doing dispatcher's work, dealing with paperwork and payments. The funds were spent evenly. He didn't spare the guys, giving the lion's share to those who did the main work, delivering cargo. However, he himself also received a lot. The opportunity to go somewhere echoed in his soul with joy, but he knew that a scandal awaited him at home. What about Mum's birthday? She's expecting us. Helen began to resent him from the doorstep. Well, I can't leave everything behind. The boys are ill, and the load is already waiting. We've got the money. You realize, not taking it now would put an end to my business. It'll give us a bad reputation. You can't wash it off. I'll stop by sometime later and congratulate her. He kissed his wife on the forehead and began to pack. He knew she wouldn't help him, so he quickly put everything he needed into his traveling bag and headed for the door. He'd known what he needed on the road for a long time, never forgot anything. When are you coming? She asked. It'll take 4 or 5 hours to get there, the same amount to get back, but plus unloading. I reckon you'll be awake by morning and I'll be home. Helen, grudgingly crossing her arms over her chest, stood nearby. Then she walked over and gave her husband a peck on the cheek after all. Helen didn't like it when he left early. It was like this all the time. And she was always complaining about being alone and lonely all the time. Sometimes in arguments, of which there were many, she said that she lived as if she were alone with her husband alive. No sooner had he retrained as a trucker than he left. Stubble's coming out, she said grudgingly. Harry ran his hand over his prickly cheek. Yeah, I didn't shave today. That's okay. I'll shave it off tomorrow. He said goodbye, walking out of the entranceway. The cool November air hit his nose. The mood was good. The rain closer to evening decided that it was snow after all, and now the white gray cloth crunched softly under his feet. Soon the ground would be white. The New Year's Eve mood that everyone was looking forward to would come. The car door slammed shut. He reached the car park, got into the truck, which was already loaded to capacity, threw his bag in the back seat and carefully pulled out onto the road. As soon as the city was behind him, he breathed a sigh of relief and turned on his favorite radio station. The music was soothing. The blizzard, meanwhile, was getting worse. At some point, visibility became 0. I even had to stop the car. No mobile phone reception. What to do? The experienced trucker was not afraid of such difficulties. He just had dinner and slept till morning. As soon as it was light, Harry continued on his way. There was nothing left to do but spend the whole night on the road. But the weather forecast didn't have this kind of snowfall. He wanted to get there as soon as possible. When the connection came up, Harry got through to the customer and his wife. Great, we're waiting. That's how we knew we were stuck somewhere along the way. We've had a hell of a snowfall here. Drive carefully, said the customer. But the conversation with his wife turned out to be less pleasant. You could have stayed home and gone to your mom's birthday party. So would have said that you just do not want to go to her, and you didn't have to leave in this weather for that, she shouted. Harry tried to explain again, but he still didn't get any understanding. 3 hours later, close to noon, the blizzard had picked up again. He was driving near a fork in the road when he noticed a woman with a huge homemade milk sign by the side of the road. In this weather, maybe there was just no one to pick her up from here. Harry slowed down, got down from the car and walked over to her. The stranger was young, with a red braid, very thin and smiling. "Hello, do you need a lift to the village?" The woman thought he was going to buy milk from her, embarrassed, confused. "It's snowing like this. Of course, now your milk will be covered with snow, and then no car will get through to your place." She nodded, as she could no longer feel her hands. The neighbor had promised to pick her up an hour ago, but apparently he had drunk again. She had plenty of milk with her. It would have been possible to walk home, but it was unrealistic to sell at least some of it and carry it all on one's back 4 kilometers over snowy roads. Harry helped to collect all the purchases, loaded everything into the car, and they drove off. The woman kept rubbing her hands, which were red from the frost. "How on earth did you manage to stay out here in this weather?" "We have to sell. I work as a milkmaid, plus I have my own cow. And my mum is ill, she needs money. If it wasn't for the weather, I would have stayed here. I haven't sold anything. It's a pity." "Well, you'll make butter. It sells for more, doesn't it?" "That's what I'll do," smiled the passenger. She was young, not more than 30 years old, and she smelled like milk. The smell evoked memories of his childhood. He had grown up in the same small village, which was 200 kilometers away from the city. The school there was very small, 5 or 6 students per class. Everyone was friendly, both the older kids and the smaller ones. Harry didn't remember his parents. His father died of pneumonia when he was 2 years old, fell through the ice on a fishing trip, could not get out for a long time. He never recovered from that, they didn't save him. And my mum left while giving birth. His grandparents taught Harry how to milk cows and ride a horse. He delivered cows, shepherded ducklings, and mowed hay. He did all the village work he could. Grandfather and grandmother lived a long time in caring for their grandson, their household, no time to get sick and wither. They were both in their 80s when they passed away. Harry remembered that time as the best time of his life. He was not afraid of anything, because he knew that he could live at home on the land, even without the city and work. He could plant a vegetable garden and raise chickens. Sometimes he wanted to leave the stuffy city to live in the countryside. But his wife was a real city dweller and did not want to go to the village, even to visit acquaintances. Harry got his license when he was still in the army and realized that he loved driving. That's how he found his life's work. Year after year, things changed. His wife Helen came along. First my grandfather was gone, then my grandmother, suddenly painlessly one and all. Both died of heart attacks. Harry sold the house in the village. Now he longed for it, but it was too late. Another family had settled there long ago. Thinking back to his childhood, Harry didn't notice how he got to the nearby village. "My house is that one over there," said a traveling companion. Harry dropped her off and drove off. She thanked him for his help. Harry got out on the motorway and quickly realized that the car had started to malfunction somehow. He knew very well when something inside was malfunctioning. Sometimes he could tell by the sound what was about to break down. It was risky to stop, so he stepped on the gas and drove to the place. While they unloaded, while he negotiated the next orders, hours passed. Empty, he drove back home. It seemed that if the car had made it all the way to the place, loaded to the brim, it should make it back. But the sound of braking was becoming more distinct. In the middle of the journey, Harry stopped and climbed out. It was getting dark, and the snow was falling and falling. There were thick crops and sky all around, and nothing else. He crawled under the car, checking what he could. Suddenly, behind him, he saw a skinny wolf. It was coming straight at him. Scared to death, Harry rushed to the car and barely had time to jump in. Through the window, he saw that there were several wolves. "Just as long as it doesn't stall," Harry pleaded. Behind him in a bag were pies, apparently left behind by his sick partner from last time. He kept meaning to throw them away, but didn't have time. Harry untied the bag and tossed the treats to the hungry wolves. The wolves ate them greedily. The car finally started, and he decided to try to get to the nearest settlement, which turned out to be the same village. He was not going to stop on the motorway and get out of the car. It was scary to even think about it. He had never seen wolves so close. If he didn't come back at that moment, he would have been mauled. How many times had there been? Harry drove to the outermost house where he had dropped off the milkmaid in the morning. When he stopped the car, he saw her get out to him. "Is something wrong?" the landlady asked. Harry got out of the car, and in the light of the streetlights he saw that there was a cow standing in a small hallway just inside the house. "Oh, what's that you've got a brownie doing in your house?" The red-haired woman sighed. "The roof of the barn is bent. I can't do it myself. I feel sorry for the cow, she's the breadwinner. You can't leave her out in the cold in this snow. How did you get here?" Harry told of his adventures. "You be careful. We had a man mauled last winter right on the river near the village. And you got out of the car on the motorway. Lots of wolves. Even shot them off, but it didn't seem to help." Harry looked at the barn with the broken roof. "The cow's in the house. Is there no one to fix it at all?" She shook her head. Harry sighed. "When do you want me to stay and try to fix it? I grew up in a village just like this. I think I can manage." The landlady pressed her lips together. "I can't pay you." "You don't have to. I understand you told me. Your mother is sick. You sell milk yourself. I'm just being a human being. And you'll help me if you let me spend the night. The car won't make it to town. I'll look at it in the morning. We'll fix your roof at the same time." She nodded. It was obvious that she was afraid to let a strange man into the house. But Harry had told her a lot about himself and tried to make sure Cassandra wasn't afraid of him. She fed Harry some soup, just like his late grandmother had once done, then put him to bed. The house was really hard. A sick woman, she could barely get out of bed. Cassandra fed her in her room. "What about Mum?" he asked when they were about to go to bed. "She needs medication. It's all treatable. Only the drugs are very expensive. I bought some. They'll run out soon. There's no more money." Harry sighed. Medication is expensive these days. At night, he couldn't sleep for a long time, as the conversation with his wife had been very difficult. Of course, she didn't get into the situation and threw a real tantrum, saying she was divorcing him. Harry should have lied, made up a good excuse, but he told the truth. The milkmaid helped him, and she needs help too. But it happens. No man's hand in the house, that's all. When his grandfather was gone, Harry often came to visit his grandmother. He planned to stay for a couple of hours, but when he saw that she couldn't cope on her own, he stayed for days. He'd fix the roof, fix the chicken coop, or put up the fence. And now, how can a poor dairymaid fix the roof? She's so thin, she can barely hold on. Helen grew up in the city, and for her, if a man stays overnight with another woman, it's cheating. Why else? That's why Harry had told the truth. Would a cheating man admit to staying with a mistress? But his wife's brains worked in some other way. He called her many times afterwards, but she didn't pick up. Her ego was important, of course. But there were more important things, like helping the helpless in a time of need. Harry opened his eyes the next morning, and for a split second he thought he was back in the house again. The house smelled like his grandmother's pancakes. It was quiet. The roosters were crowing outside the window. Suddenly he jumped up, remembering that there was a broken-down lorry outside the yard. There was still a shed with a broken roof in the yard, and at home in the city flat his beloved was sharpening an axe. And why had he told her the truth? Cassandra fed her guests pancakes. Turns out she's been up for a while. The cows were milked early in the morning, so her work was already done. The first day they went together to fix the barn. They found some boards, brought them in. Cassandra was wiry, strong for a woman. She helped Harry with everything. Asked him something. They laughed together and did things together. "You know, you remind me of my father. He was just like you. Tough, he could do all the chores. A real bloke," she said. Harry smiled. "I'm a real man. I didn't have a father at all growing up. My grandfather taught me everything. That's what's important. The fact that you take on everything. You're good. Lucky your wife." He'd said he was married right away. Cassandra knew that and showed no sympathy. Yeah, she didn't really care. There were so many problems that she didn't remember herself anymore. Lucky. He remembered his wife and thought she'd hardly appreciate it. Things were different in the city, after all. He felt like he was living in the wrong place. "Do you like it in the village?" Harry asked. Cassandra shrugged. "I haven't given it much thought, I just live. There's no opportunity to leave anyway. So yeah, I like it. It's probably nice to be in the city, to walk around, but living. No, I was thinking the same thing. I like the sky and clean air. I used to be a trucker. I used to stop in a field, put on some music and just look at the stars. They are brighter there than in the city and in the countryside. Too, the sky is a sight to behold." They talked a lot. It came out somehow by itself. They found common themes, and their views were similar. They both liked Brodsky, listened to similar music, and liked the same cinema. Towards evening, Harry noticed that Cassandra's cheeks were burning. "You're not ill?" he asked. "I don't know." He touched his forehead and realized that it wasn't good. The fever was high, so Harry put Cassandra to bed. He made tea like his grandmother had taught him. There were raspberries and honey in the fridge. "I'll take dinner myself," he thought. He went to her mum and met her, explaining that he was there by chance, that he was not a maniac and not a thief. She turned out to be a woman of humor. Harry liked her very much. Good-natured and wise, not like his mother-in-law. She was spiteful, petty, always counting money, and wondering who earned how much, and always hinting to Harry that he could do a better job of supporting her daughter. Even when things got better and Harry started his own business, she still wasn't happy. Cassandra spent the entire next day in bed. Harry called his wife and told her the truth again. He said he would stay and help with the household chores. Helen was no longer talking about the divorce, but she was still hurling insults and accusations. Harry milked the cows that Cassandra usually milked. She wanted to give up the job, but he persuaded her to let him do it. Cassandra showed him where to go and warned him that an acquaintance of hers would come and do the work instead. He got the money and brought it to Cassandra, pennies on the dollar. How does she live on that? Then Harry made breakfast for everyone himself. Cassandra was up at last, too, doing chores around the house. She started coughing. Apparently, she'd had a bad case of the milk trade on the road. The poor thing must have had a fever, helping him finish the roof. Harry finished the repairs that day, oiled the barn, laid straw, insulation as his grandfather had taught him, also patched up the chicken coop. Cassandra had when she came out of the house. "Harry, it feels good to the point of tears. Thank you so much. I mean, it's not like anyone has ever helped me, no one for nothing. It's so great. You've helped me too. Now I just have to sort out the car." Helen was resentful and was about to come to the village herself. But Harry forbade it, assuring her that he had no love affair, that he had simply met a man in trouble and stayed to help. Still, the next few days were not busy with work. "I'll get the car done and be back tomorrow," he promised. It was necessary to be back the day after tomorrow. There were flights scheduled, there was work to be done. Cassandra finally felt better, and for the rest of the day she helped Harry in any way she could. Not understanding anything, making completely stupid assumptions, which amused him terribly. He loved that she was so interested in everything, lively, inquisitive, positive. Despite his hard life, the car had finally been tidied up, but only temporarily. "I'll get to the city, but I'll have to stand for repairs. It's a pity, but it's okay. There are other lorries. Work won't stand up." It was evening. It was already dark outside the window. The wind and snow had passed, and it was very quiet all around. The previous evening, Harry had played cards with Cassandra's mother, Mrs. Marion. It had been fun. She beat him because she was good at cheating. "When are you going?" Cassandra asked. She didn't want him to leave, but she didn't dare ask another man's husband to stay with her either. "Tomorrow, where this night? God forbid he break down on the road again. You have wolves here. I don't want to get in trouble." Cassandra laughed and smiled happily. "Well then, let's go. It's cold out there. Let's run home. You'll catch another cold. You're not recovered enough as it is." Cassandra and Harry went in and drank tea and talked about life and childhood. She turned out to be 4 years younger than him. In fact, it was a small difference, and Harry realized he liked Cassandra as a person. She would make a great mate. The next day, after a delicious breakfast, he was getting ready for the road, saying goodbye to everyone, and was on his way to the wicket when a big bald man walked in. He was wearing his jacket open and looking very insolent. "Who is this?" he asked Cassandra. Harry wasn't afraid of those kinds. Growing up in the countryside as a child, he had fought often. Didn't start it himself, of course, but he was nowhere without it. "Sebastian, don't." "Sebastian, he was just helping." His car broke down. There was a snowstorm, Cassandra interjected. Harry looked at Cassandra, then at the man. The man came up to him and started pushing him. Harry responded in kind, but Cassandra stepped in between them. "Sebastian, let's go inside. How did you even get here? It's still early." She threw Harry a sad look and led the man into the house. Apparently the husband. Harry stepped outside the wicket, and there stood some elderly grandfather. "You should get the hell out of here, bro. It's Cassandra's husband, been sitting around, and here he is back. I see your car has been parked here for a long time. Every self-respecting man would not tolerate him," said the grandfather. Cassandra was an orphan, so the state gave her a house in the country instead of a flat. This is where her father used to live, so she got a house here and a woman with her. Sebastian's mother, not hers, she didn't like Cassandra. When Sebastian went to prison, she went sick. Cassandra took care of her, and they became friends. And now they're like family. She was the one who wanted a divorce. There was nothing between us. I wanted to justify myself, but Harry waved his hand, jumped into the lorry, and accelerated. Cassandra was going to get in trouble for him now. And why didn't she tell me she was married? On the road, he kept wondering how she was going to be there now with this. Did she leave? Won't he beat her? After all, he's only just got free. Why would he beat his wife right away and go right back? But will he believe her? I didn't want her to get in trouble now. But there's nowhere to go. He'd already been caught there. A fight had almost broken out. Harry realized there was nothing he could do about it. He returned home, and there was his daughter waiting for him. His wife Helen wasn't happy, but there was no scandal. She even made pies, though she'd never been much for cookery before. Maybe she was jealous. The next few days put everything in its proper place. Home, work, meetings, and only the occasional memory of Cassandra troubled the mind. Harry still had her phone number, and one evening after work he decided to dial it. It was snowing outside the window. It was warm, and streetlights were shining everywhere. "Cassandra?" "Yes, hello." The conversation was a little strained, awkward. Harry asked if everything was okay after he left. Cassandra said everything was fine, settled down, but she sounded like it wasn't like that at all. They chatted about something inconsequential, but even those few minutes were enough to lift Harry's spirits. All the next day he felt happy, realizing that the conversation was the reason for it. Harry insinuated to himself that it was just sympathy, but towards evening he dialed her number again. "Hi, if you're not busy, please talk to me for a bit. I feel like you're the only person who understands me so well," Harry said. She sighed. "Yeah, I have that feeling too. Let's talk. What's the weather like?" Talking about the weather quickly changed to some personal experiences, and then they were already discussing general topics. That's how they began to communicate almost every day. If Cassandra was having trouble with a core, Harry would advise her on the best way to do it. He was so busy at work. There was so much to do that he couldn't get away. Cassandra no longer spoke of her husband. Harry kept quiet about his wife. Actually, Helen surprised him too. "I'm pregnant," she said from the doorstep one day. Harry hugged her. "Wow, it's been a long time coming, hasn't it? How come? It didn't work out, did it?" "Well, it's working now. I tried to do it myself. It's nearly 2 months old." Harry had dreamed of having a son, and the news was a joy to him. Besides, Helen had miscarried early in their relationship, and they had nearly divorced then. He wanted to leave, and would have left had it not been for the news of the pregnancy, which unfortunately ended badly. Helen was very worried, so Harry decided to stay with her. He just couldn't leave his wife in her condition. Cassandra's calls became less frequent. The baby had changed priorities, and Helen decided to rearrange the house and put up new wallpaper. Somehow she was sorting out old boxes. Harry had just woken up and was drinking tea in the kitchen when Helen came to him with the letter. "Harry, what is it?" she asked. He looked at it and knew at once what the paper was. "I'll explain," he said calmly. Helen folded her arms across her chest. "Do bother." Harry skimmed over the text and looked up. His wife was looking at him in disbelief. He understood nervousness in her position was not to be tolerated. "It was when we were first married. Cynthia was the wife of a close friend of mine who, if you remember, crashed. She was left with a small child by him who needed help, and I found the money. You sold the car then. I was told there was an accident, and you owed a lot of money. I remember that. But you have such a temper. You wouldn't have understood and I couldn't have done otherwise. Her baby is alive now because of that operation. There, the count was weeks. I wouldn't have forgiven myself if I hadn't helped. She's thanking you very tenderly. Maybe it's your baby. Maybe you went to see her that time. You were staying with her, and there's no milkmaid with cows. Harry shook his head. I can introduce you and she'll tell you all about it herself. There are hospital discharges, I guess. You don't talk rubbish. I was helping the man. Helen shattered the mug she held in her hands. While she listened to Harry's excuses, it had a picture of them together on their wedding day, an anniversary present. Harry shuddered. Feel better? He asked. This made Helen even angrier. You know what I'm sick of? You cheat on me, and you always have. And I'm holding on to you for some reason, pretending to be pregnant. I'm sick of it. There's no baby. And you know what? I have someone else too. And he's better than you in every way. I'm going with him. Well, that makes me feel better. Go to your milkmaid, Harry, or whatever it is you've got. She went off to her room. Harry drank his tea quietly from a mug. This was news to him. Once she'd been pissed off, the truth had come out. So there was no baby. It was just convenient for her to have both a husband and a lover. But what about her new outfits and that bracelet? Should have realized a long time ago that she had someone. Harry listened to himself. How did he feel when he learnt the truth? Their marriage had been a long one, and now it had just shattered following that mug. He smiled as relief came. Helen was packing her things and shouting at him. Harry went out quietly. I'll be back tonight. Will you have enough time to pack? Take everything you want? Or are you going to file for divorce, or should I? She flashed her eyes. I'll file for divorce myself. And don't you doubt it. I'll be gone when you get back. I hate you. You've ruined my whole life. Harry was startled, but at the door she shouted to him. And for that matter, there was no baby. And back then I just didn't want to lose you, you naive fool. And it turns out you were cheating on me even then. Harry packed up and left. He even called Cassandra, but she didn't answer. Busy, I guess. Well, then I guess I'll have to stop by and see her. Nothing else would keep him from being with her. He finally admitted to himself that he was in love with her. Yes, just like that. And Helen had become almost repulsive to him. Cassandra was like him. They shared the same views and they understood each other. Even being around her was mentally healing. Harry returned home, slept overnight, and drove to the village in the morning. He was ready to fight for her to leave her husband and stay with him. Ready to run his business from the suburbs, just to be near her. And he was already thinking about what they would name their children. When he parked the car out front, the first thing that caught his eye was that the shed they were renovating had been destroyed. It was as if someone had deliberately broken it down. The cow was no longer there. No chickens in sight either. Cassandra, he shouted. No one answered. Harry went into the hayloft. It was empty. He walked to the bedroom where Mrs. Marion used to be. He remembered how they had played cards and how cheerful she had been in spite of her illness. It was different now. She lay motionless and only flapped her eyes. What do you want? Came from somewhere above his ear with the smell of booze. The same ex-con appeared in front of Harry. I've come to see Cassandra. Remember, I was here when my car broke down. There was no need to scandalize. The convict threw him a long look. She's dead. Harry sat down in the chair that stood by the sick woman's bedside in surprise. The woman began to wave one hand. What's wrong with her? Harry asked, nodding at the man's mum. Stroke shattered and Cassandra passed away from pneumonia, buried recently. Harry immediately remembered that she had caught a bad cold on that road, then was sick some more, apparently never treated. God, how could that be? He didn't know what to do, how to act, went to the exit, seeing that he wasn't welcome. The woman in the bed tried to say something, but he couldn't understand anything. Already at the threshold, he turned round. Look, maybe you need some help. You tell me, I'll help your mother, especially if you... The man shook his head. Nothing. Harry walked away. got in his car and drove off. All the way he cried, remembering how good it had been with Cassandra, how wonderful she had been, and why fate had been so cruel to that poor woman. Now he realized he was all alone, thought he had a backup. Naive. Should have thought before, should have left Helen back then and been with the one I loved. Maybe she'd still be alive if he'd had the sense to realize then that he loved her and only wanted to be with her. These thoughts began to torment Harry. Day after day he got drunk several times, missed a couple of important work calls. Having learnt that Harry was not in the best of health now, the situation was taken advantage of by competitors who had already swept up more than one small businessman in their town. All Harry got was a phone call saying, "There are some men with guns in our office, come over." By the time he got there, it was all done. He was threatened and forced to sign papers, a raid in broad daylight. These guys were obviously being backed up by a cop. It couldn't have been otherwise. In the evening, coming home to his empty flat, he was still talking to his lawyer. It's a complicated case. They'll have lawyers from the capital. Everything is bought. The business is small. Big companies they don't touch. You don't fight it. In fact, you've got something left, haven't you? Maybe you can find other clients. And what's to pay those salaries now? But that's the concern of the new owners. What about them? I think it's easier for you to start over. It'll be real easy. They'll put everything up for auction tomorrow. Finish it off. While you're gathering evidence, by the time they open the case, run the background checks. There's nothing to go on. Trust me. It's not worth it. Take a bite out of it and run like jackals. You got savings? Start from scratch? Finished with the conversation, Harry sank doomfully onto the sofa. It was very empty on his soul. However, it didn't end there. Of course, in the divorce, Helen had filed a request for division of property, even though she knew that the flat had never belonged to her. But the legal points were on her side. Harry stood up and said, "Take it." Packed up his things, only the essentials, and moved into the car. It was depressing. There was no energy to even just look for a place to live. He advertised and occasionally had a chance to earn some money. He lived in a lorry until the following spring. He ate whatever he could get his hands on. He drank. People saw him unshaven and gaunt and offered to help, but Harry just refused. He didn't need anything anymore. He didn't want to live. One day, towards the middle of March, he went to a stall to buy cigarettes. On his way back, he saw a girl in a wheelchair trying to cross the street. The wheelchair was expensive and manageable, but the roads in this town didn't leave much to chance. She was desperately trying to get out. Suddenly, a red car was coming at her from around a bend. Harry jumped out into the road and at the last moment managed to pull the pram out from under the wheels of the car. The car flashed, honked, and sped away. Harry, on the other hand, took the stranger to the curb and turned around to face him. To his surprise, the face looked familiar. He was shocked. Once upon a time, when he was just starting out in business, he had often been commissioned by businessmen. Harry had been present during the negotiations, as deliveries had to be made continuously and on time. He personally supervised everything, for which he received the approval of William Cooper. Harry proved to be a reliable partner, who, if something went wrong, got behind the wheel himself and drove the order. If a lorry broke down, he rented one, but always delivered the goods safely and without delays. Tiffany, William's daughter, was often present at the negotiations. Even then, she was a real shark of business, understanding the smallest details and subtleties of the process. She was also very kind and funny. Harry looked at her now, without makeup, crying with fear in her wheelchair. "How did you end up here?" She stopped crying, looking up into Harry's face. He was hardly easy to recognize now either. "Harry, I believe you used to work for us." "Yeah, you've got a haulage business." He nodded. Tiffany wiped away her tears. "I need to get to the other side." "Take me to it. There's a cafe over there. If you want to talk, I'll tell you." They crossed the road. Harry bought her the medication she was originally going for, and then they set up at the cafe. She was treated very gently because of her position. The chair made people look at her differently. It was only the pity that disgusted her, and she stopped responding to the special treatment. "My father and I, we were in a terrible accident. He crashed, I survived. Almost, as you can see, now I'm chained to this. Is there any way to fix that? Harry asked. No, you can't. All my life now I'll be riding. Except don't feel sorry for me, okay? She said. Harry nodded. You know, it's so hard to run a business these days. Mom's out of her mind with grief. I have to be the strong one. I have my father's temper, though she smiled and looked down at the floor. What? Harry asked. Always told everyone that I have my father's temper. Except that he and I aren't even related. It came to light when he had surgery. I started donating blood and they told me I couldn't even be his daughter, even purely technically. Dad gave my mom a hard time. She punched him in the face for being suspicious. And it turned out we'd been switched at the maternity hospital. Our mothers had the same names and they put the same tags on the babies and mixed them up. Wow, what a story they were found. Tiffany shook her head. No, they weren't found. Missing in action. All I know is that she must have had a birthmark on her wrist like Daddy. We made inquiries and were told she had a spot. She's on the wanted list now. Dad went to the authorities when he was alive, but now I don't know if they'll find her. He's been gone for 6 months or more. Harry told her his sad story about his wife and Cassandra, who had died. Tiffany even wept when she heard he was so sad. You understand business very well, don't you? I remember my father praising you a lot, saying you were reliable, loyal. You know, I really need an assistant. It's so dangerous now. Everyone wants to cheat you. You know that. Why don't you come to me? I can give you a room in my house, by the way. It's completely empty now. I don't mean to imply anything. I just want to help you. And myself too. Harry thought for a moment. Living in a car wasn't bad, of course, but it was getting tiresome. Good. That would be great. I really just don't have anywhere to go right now. They traveled together to her house. Mom greeted her guest warily and didn't even hide her distrust. For the first few days, Harry had been uncomfortable at their house. He didn't eat with them. He snacked at work. Tiffany saw that he didn't have much money and personally took him to the shop where her father always dressed. Harry, on the other hand, helped her with more than just business. He became her literal right hand, helping her get around town, helping out at home. Her life became much easier and more fun. He also met Tiffany's fiancé. He was doing an internship in London and couldn't be around physically. Also from a wealthy family, a hereditary businessman. He had a crush on the girl. Harry met him via Skype. Andrew asked him to keep a better eye on his favorite girl. He trusted her and wasn't jealous. There was some special bond between them. Harry often envied them. Remembering Cassandra, he wanted to visit her grave, but somehow there was not enough time. By the end of the summer, Harry had settled into the company, kept abreast of everything, and was still living with Tiffany and her mother. The latter had already taken him in as a family member and was very grateful to him. It was as if the house had come alive with his arrival. Harry was honest, decent, cheerful. He was easy to contact, could support any conversation. Towards the autumn, he received a strange phone call. Major Smith is bothering you, the receiver said. Good afternoon. What can I do for you? He asked, surprised. Harry was at work in the office. Tiffany was rummaging through paperwork as usual, and he was sitting at a nearby desk. I was asked to call you by Marion Morris. Do you know her? Harry frowned. I'm sorry, I don't recall. I don't know if you remember her or not, but she asked me to pass on information. Cassandra is alive and in Hospital 13. She's in a coma. Harry rounded his eyes. Mrs. Marion, he interjected. Good day. Hey. Harry stared at Tiffany, and she pulled away from the papers and looked at him. What is it? She asked in a friendly manner. I just got a call saying Cassandra's alive, in hospital number 13. Who called you? Harry found out later that afternoon. He and Tiffany dropped their cases and drove to the village first. Harry entered the house where Cassandra had once lived and saw Mrs. Marion there. She had recovered from her stroke and could already do things as usual. Sebastian, my son, will be back soon. Did you get the message? She asked conspiratorially. Harry nodded. What's it all about? I was afraid to tell you, but only you can help. Cassandra was intimidated by my son. Smashed up the barn you built, sold the cows, scattered the chickens. Cassandra lived in fear for months, for helping you. He beat her, and one day he overdid it. She collapsed and never woke up. She's been in a coma for so long. The doctors say they have to take her off the machines. Sebastian is cruel, just like his father. He was that kind of man too, spared no life. I owe it to her. Then I'll have to report it, Harry said. Your son is going to go to jail again, isn't he? Serves him right. He's hurting me. I keep quiet, I clean up after him, and I'm still weak. He acts like a beast. There's nothing human left in him. Let him sit down. At least I'll breathe easy, because I'm afraid he'll kill me one day. At least he won't do it in prison. Harry took Mrs. Marion with him, and together they went to the hospital to see Cassandra. All three of them were allowed into the ward. Tiffany didn't want to stay in the car any longer. Mrs. Marion cried when she saw Cassandra. Harry was smiling. He took her hand and shuddered. "What's that on her wrist?" she asked. He turned her hand and noticed a long reddish birthmark there. Tiffany clamped her hand over her mouth. "There it is found. It's her. Dad had the same spot. There's no such thing as coincidence. I'm living her life now and should probably be in her shoes." Tiffany was a very powerful person and immediately ordered that the DNA test be done immediately. As soon as she had confirmation of what she already knew, Cassandra was transported to a pay clinic that specialized in such cases. "You don't think I would have helped anyway. You love her so much after all, and you've helped me a lot. But she's also my sister. Well, not my sister, of course. I don't even know what to call her. She's my parents' daughter, and she'll be my sister if she wakes up." Harry drank tea with valerian. It had been a hard day. After the hospital, they drove to the station, where a small financial reward from Tiffany sped up the process. A statement was taken from Mrs. Marion, and by evening Sebastian was in the remand center. He wasn't told it was my fault he was detained. They said there was some other witness. "Thank you for everything. I love my son, don't I? But he doesn't belong here. He said many times he feels better in prison, freer. Maybe something will change as the years go by. Please take care of her. She's a very good girl." With those words, Mrs. Marion saw Harry and Tiffany off that day. The doctors said they would try to help Cassandra, but the chances were slim. She had gone too long without treatment. The clinic had experimental methods of inducing comas, and they worked. People were brought here even from the capital. One professor's unique program had helped a lot of people. From that day on, Harry went to see her every day, talking to her, asking the doctors how she was doing, and if there was any improvement. In the first month, he heard only one thing. "No, it's the same, no change." They brought her blood counts back to normal and provided her body with all the vitamins and minerals it needed. The treatment continued, but she still did not wake up. When she heard that her own daughter had been found, Tiffany's mother, Mrs. Megan, came to the hospital. She held her hand for a long time, crying. She, like Harry, came to see her daughter every day, telling her all about her life, all sorts of things. That day, Mrs. Megan arrived in a bad mood, took her daughter's hand. "You know, I've been on the phone to Mrs. Marion. She told me about your difficult childhood and how strong you grew up. We've been telling Tiffany all her life that she has her father's character. But she's not her own daughter after all. You were switched at the maternity ward. You, on the other hand, seem to have your daddy's personality. Tiffany's been thinking of you as a sister for a long time. And then there's this bloke, Harry, who loves you, I'm told. Come back to us, we're waiting for you." The mother looked at her daughter for a long time, expecting her hand to twitch or her eyelids to move. But it didn't. She left. And just 2 hours later, the nurse called Tiffany. "Cassandra's awake, she's coming round, she's ready to be seen." Tiffany almost screamed into the phone with excitement. Everyone came running to her screams, Harry and Mrs. Megan alike. No, of course it's too early. But the fact that she's awake is already wonderful news. "I come back tomorrow night. The first tests will be ready. We need to examine her. What's the state of her brain? What about basic reflex motor skills? It happens all the time. MRI showed that her fractures have already healed, but it's not clear how. So we'll keep looking. Harry had been up all night with worry. Coming into the kitchen to get a drink of water, he met Mrs. Megan there. "Are you awake already?" asked. "Of course I'm awake," Mrs. Megan replied. "I'm finally seeing my baby for the first time in so many years. How can I sleep? I mean, I carried her under my heart, and then she was taken away. I didn't look into it, but I'd put those responsible for it in jail." Harry shrugged. "You could put them in jail, but what good would that do? And would you be depriving the right person of their freedom? It's the way it is with us. One person is guilty. They put someone else in jail, someone they can blame, but the real culprit goes unpunished." "How many years has it been?" Mrs. Megan laughed. "But it hasn't been so long that everybody's dead. I'm still young myself, and the doctors were young then, with only nurses of age working." They talked and Harry left. The next day, the three of them returned to the hospital. When they were led into the ward, Mrs. Megan couldn't hold back her tears, and Cassandra lay there not understanding who it was or why she was crying on her chest. "We're going to tell you everything now. Sis, while you were in a coma, you got a whole family," Tiffany said. They told everything. Cassandra nodded and asked questions, but she still felt weak. When the doctor asked everyone to leave, she took Harry's hand. "Wait," she asked. When everyone was out, she asked, "How is Mrs. Marion?" "She suffered a stroke, but she's fine now. Saw that creep beating you. He's in jail now and will be there for a long time. It's scary, the whole thing." "How could you get involved with someone like that?" he asked. "I don't. It just happened that way. There were no grooms especially. Not much choice. But Sebastian took care of me, carried me in his arms. We got married, and he went straight to jail. We never really got along. Please don't leave me again. Your Sebastian told me at first that you were dead, and I thought so for 6 months. 6 months I mourned you." Cassandra pressed her lips together. "I'm sorry, I didn't know. He's a very cruel man, and he belongs in prison. Even his own mother thinks so." At that moment, the doctor entered the room. "Okay, that's enough for today." "Wait, it's been so long since we've seen each other," Cassandra said. "I won't wait. I'll just run out of here. The patient needs rest. You want her healthy, or what?" Harry held up his hands. That's it. I'm leaving for now. We'll come back tomorrow to check on her. I left my mobile on the table. Text me if you need anything." They left and Cassandra picked up her phone. It was a simple one, but it had 3 contacts saved: Mom, Tiffany, and Harry, internet and phone charges. Wow, she's never been taken care of like this. She used to want to watch something on the internet, read the news, but she couldn't immediately remember how to do it. "It's okay, not all at once." She put the phone down on the bedside table. "And now an IV, and sleep," the nurse said as she walked in. Cassandra didn't immediately start to get up. The recovery process had been long and painful. She was visited by the police, who took a statement for the court. Cassandra told everything. Sebastian was given 4 years for it. Last time it was extended 3 times. He was causing trouble time and time again, fighting in prison, breaking all the rules. He's not likely to get out early, and Cassandra and Tiffany became real friends. They'd call each other a lot, talk to each other. Tiffany told Cassandra what she knew about Harry. "He's been staying with me for a long time. He's told me about himself, his childhood, his wife. They had a complicated relationship, but he's all yours now. He talked about you as if you were more important to him than anyone else, and he seems to be very much in love with you." Cassandra smiled. "Really? Because he never said so himself." "Well, would a man say that? He's like a brother to me, and you're like a little sister to me, and I'll be very happy if everything goes well between you two." "You like him too, don't you?" she asked. Cassandra nodded, smiling bashfully. "But I'm still married." "Is that a problem when your husband who beat you half to death is in jail? You just say the word. We'll sort it out with you in no time. I have lawyers. Did you realize you'll never be alone with your problems? Do you realize you've been living your life wrong? And honey, you were born into a rich family and worked as a milkmaid. Fate played a cruel trick on us. But now you are my family. My good one. You have me and Mom and Harry. Tiffany hugged Cassandra, and she cried. You were born to live in a rich family. I'm the one with my temperament that should have been milking cows. Do you want to? Cassandra asked through her tears. Tiffany laughed. I got such an education that I've only seen cows in pictures. My father taught me everything and I will teach you. We'll have a women's team. I inherited the farm after he died. But Mom and I decided you should have half the shares. We'll work together. Cassandra shook her head. I don't need anything. I'm just glad to have you. So tired of being alone and tired of dealing with everything on my own. It's hard. But that's okay. You'll be discharged soon. You'll stay with Harry at our place. I wouldn't want to let him go. You see, I'm a wheelchair user. He helps me with everything. I'm like a handicap without him. Anyway, it's out of the question. You live with me. Cassandra was smiling now. For the first time in her life, someone had decided for her, and someone was taking care of her. For the first time, she didn't feel alone. The day she was discharged, Harry came to pick her up, getting a bunch of recommendations from the doctor. Cassandra, I've been wanting to talk for a long time. What are we like children? I liked you right away. I'm drawn to you all the time. I've been at home in my body, but I've been with you in my soul. Shall we try it? We'll go on dates. We'll live together and go on dates, she smiled. Harry nodded. No one's ever had that before. And you and I will if you want. I liked you too. Let's try it. After moving home, Cassandra began to get involved in her work. She immediately set about cleaning, but was stopped. There's a cleaning lady. What's that for? I can't. I'm not used to being cleaned up. Mrs. Megan walked happily round the house. There's my unspoiled daughter, she said. Tiffany only laughed. Yes, and I'm spoiled. But that doesn't mean you can't kiss me. 6 months later, the sisters had a fancy wedding, at which, of course, Mrs. Merriam was present. The train raced through the morning fog. The boundless southern distance flashed past with a green stripe, interspersed with the blue stripe of the river. Beautiful. Said an elderly man, a neighbor in the compartment, and poured cognac into his tea. Or would you like tea and bread? No, thank you, John Smith. I don't drink alcohol. It makes my hands shake, said Jake. And I'm a cardiac surgeon. One false move and that's it. A man could die. So if you'll excuse me, I'll pass. Jake stared out at the scenery. I do allow myself the occasional drink, John Smith smiled good-naturedly. It's a good stress reliever. I'm a lawyer. I've seen a lot of things. He took a sip from his glass of tea and looked at Jake questioningly. You're from New York, you said, aren't you? Where are you going now? On vacation, Jake answered hesitantly. If you could say it was an exile. Anyway, it's a long story. I'm in no hurry to go anywhere. So tell me what's going on, John said, and made himself comfortable, intending to pass the time listening to someone else's story. Well, where to start? Probably with the fact that I was given a condition, either to be investigated and at best get a suspended sentence, which, in fact, does not make it any easier, or go to the middle of nowhere but with an unblemished reputation and the opportunity to practice medicine. Next, who exiled you? Made you an offer you can't refuse. Her chief medical officer, to cover up the unpleasant story about the missing narcotic painkillers, Jake explained. So it wasn't your fault? John Smith asked. Of course not, Jake said indignantly and continued. I was on duty that night. There were a lot of late-night calls, an emergency room. In short, it was a hot night. I had to turn around, keep the nurses moving. In general, I was forced to be on duty more often than others, motivated by the fact that I have higher qualifications and more extensive knowledge. This, of course, was not to my fiancée Ashley's liking. I could understand her. No fiancé, no money. The salary, to put it mildly, doesn't match the qualifications. But the doctor in charge wasn't going to give me any raises. So we got a patient with a gunshot wound to the chest. It's a case right in my specialty, so I'm in the OR prepping for surgery. And then Kyle, my fellow student and colleague, comes running up. I forgot to sign out for narcotics. I also asked him if it was okay, since I had indicated that I had only spent 2 ampoules of painkillers. He replied that the quantity of drugs in the report matched. So I signed the document purely on trust. I've known each other for so many years, and then it turned out that 1 ampoule was missing. That's how your friend counted the last of the medicine, said John Smith. That's on him, Jake said. That's what I told the head doctor. Only I was the one under suspicion, and I signed it. And Kyle said he hadn't seen anything and didn't. So there you go. And to keep the story quiet, the chief decided to fire me from the clinic and move me to a no-go village. He didn't want any publicity, especially since our hospital is considered a model hospital. His head would have exploded. Am I the only one who has no idea where the damn ampoule went? I mean, everything was there. And I'll tell you where, squinted the traveling companion, who began to like this young doctor. Just tell me, my hearty friend, weren't you afraid that this Kyle of yours was saving up evil for you? To be honest, he was, Jake admitted. At first, he was jealous of me because I'd had an easier time studying to be a doctor. Then he'd taken offense when I'd been assigned to a clinic in the capital, but his rich father had gotten him a job in our department by any means necessary. Again, he did not like and bitter that I was promoted to the head of the department, or rather I used to be, and patients were more likely to see me than him. What are you implying? How old are you? Naive, like little children. Ye, laughed John Smith. Now tell me, who's going to be the head of the department now? There's no one else but Kyle, Jake answered quickly. He slapped himself on the forehead. That's it? I didn't realize. So you're saying Kyle set me up, cleared a spot for himself, maybe for something else? We'll have to weigh it all out. He hesitated. Let's talk, you'll remember something else. Let's see what the landlady put me with. Cookies, ruddy chickens, potatoes, meat and cottage cheese pies, smoked sausage, fresh cucumbers, tomatoes, a muffin, cookies, and a 3-liter jar of compote magically appeared on the table. Wow, Jake exclaimed. I'm drooling like it's New Year's Eve. Well, the laughter started, said John Smith. There's no telling what the occupation will be like in the town you're going to. It's all a side effect of 30 years of living together with a wife. So go ahead and get a wife, he said with his mouth full. I'd love to get married, but there's no one to marry.
How come? Wondered the neighbor.
My fiancé left me when I was fired from a prestigious clinic. Said it was out of the way with a loser. And 2 weeks ago, we applied for the registry office. Do you know how frustrating that is? For better or for worse, as they say. Why do you need such a wife who will run away at any problem? Anyone can change in wealth. Try to live when there's only bread and water on the table. That's you, my friend. We have a lot of things now, that's why they're coming. We used to live well, but we helped each other. Raised 3 sons, brought up good people. You too will find a kind, brave wife, with whom you will go into fire and water together. Look, don't lose her. Yes, I think you're right. I was worried for nothing, Jake agreed after the men had refreshed themselves. They continued their conversation in the vestibule, where John Smith was smoking a pipe. Say, Jake, did you do anything to provoke this Kyle guy's anger? He asked, squinting his eyes. It appeared that he was beginning to look like Sherlock Holmes. Yeah, there was a case, Jake remembered. I cured a difficult patient of his. I don't understand your humor. What's wrong with that? The interlocutor wondered. What's wrong is that you shook his authority. Without thinking of the consequences, interfered too rudely with the course of treatment. Burst in, you might say, saw that the patient is injected with drugs from which he could be paralyzed, and scolded a nurse who had nothing to do with it. I couldn't imagine Kyle being that unprofessional. The nurse messed up. Then I had to apologize to her. And then Kyle didn't forgive me for calling him a mediocre doctor in front of everyone. I mean, really, I should have kept quiet if he wouldn't listen to me any other way. And what did the head doctor say when you were arguing? John Smith asked. Oh no, he took a neutral position, replied Jake. Then I found out something interesting. It turns out the patient was a very wealthy man. A nurse told me before I left that rich man already had a will drawn up in favor of his young wife. While he was in the hospital, she went to nightclubs and told everyone that she would soon become a rich widow and then fly to the Maldives. But I completely changed his treatment regimen, and the man got out of the vicious cycle Kyle had him in. It turns out I unwittingly messed up the plans of my wife, who often visited me in the hospital. Guess who? Well, already, of course, John Smith replied.
No, she hasn't. She was visiting Kyle. That's what my co-workers told me later too, Jake said.
That's where it all went from there. But what else is there to tell? This couple, they say they went to restaurants together, the doctor continued. That's their business. Don't you think, dear friend, that this is the truest conspiracy of all? John Smith, and I killed a bet that you were the one who was framed for pulling Pokrovsky out of the dead, breaking all the plans of the failed Widow Tower and her accomplice. And it was your buddy Kyle who did it. That can't be right. It never even occurred to me. It did, Jake replied. Or was he shocked at his compartment mate's conclusion? What had to happen for someone who took an oath to be a doctor to deliberately extinguish the life of someone who put his trust in him? That's real murder. What a scoundrel. What now? John Smith sighed. It seems that it can't be undone. There's no turning back the clock. Try to justify yourself in the new place. After all, in the village live people who deserve such a talented doctor like you. Thank you for your kind words. It's important now, Jake Wilson replied gratefully. After that conversation, it was as if a stone had fallen from his soul. He was ready for a new life and was not afraid of change. Leopardly, in the morning, the train made a brief stop at the Little Essie station. It was time to say goodbye to John Smith. Hold on. John Smith gave him a fatherly hug, and I think there are a lot of good people out there. Thanks for the kind words, Jake replied and smiled. Lucky to have met you along the way. Are we going to be long? 2 minutes, the conductor shouted. Jake stepped off the train. He turned and waved. Now he was turning over a new leaf. The station was green and bathed in the first rays of sunlight. Jake took a deep breath of the air. It was sweet and scented with flowers. Suddenly he felt happy, as if in an old movie. A young promising doctor comes to the countryside and faces the hardships of life and the intricacies of fate. Jake exclaimed at the top of his voice and strode toward the small building with a sign that read Alessia Station. There was a big barn lock on the door, however. Where to go next? He didn't know, and so he sat down on a bench to wait for the ticket booth worker. Don't wait, you won't, came a voice from somewhere. It's a day off. It's Saturday. Jake turned around. Behind him stood a small grandfather with a bushy beard, smoking. A cloud of smoke hovered around his head, but it didn't bother the stranger. Boris, I've never compared anyone from the train to you. That's funny. Visitor, Grandpa asked. No, just me, Jake answered.
And here's the unfortunate thing, the doctor who was assigned to us from Chicago was upset. It was a waste of a horse, wasn't it?
Why not? I'll go with you, said Jake. Well, that's understandable, Grandpa sighed. I don't ask you, you'll have the tea. What's your... Wilson, Jake answered, and he felt funny at his grandfather's talk and smiled. Was there a doctor coming to see you? They say she was kicked out of Chicago for something. So they sent her to us. Our women are afraid to go to her now. They say she'll heal them to death. And they say they won't let them in until they're crying. Maybe it's good that she didn't come. A doctor, but to hell with her. We ain't got no Wilsons. But we will now, Jake laughed. Why, Grandfather? Is there a paramedic station in your village? It doesn't work, said Grandfather. And there's a nurse working in it. What a good girl. She manages to do everything and milk a cow and give someone an injection. Our doctors ran away from us. Only her heels were shining. I have no he says. I immediately galloped to town and got married there. Desperate. You know how I'm called Grandpa Fedor, so call me Grandpa Fedor. I see. I'm Jake Wilson. The staff at the hospital called me Jake. So I'm going to be working here with your little sister. What's her middle name? And I don't have a case. Makarovna. Grandpa Fyodor was taken aback. So you're our new doctor. You're a woman. That's what. Have the women lied again? I've made a mistake in front of you, Jake. I'm sorry. That's all right, Jake said. Now let's go to your hospital to see her right away. Grandpa Fyodor realized. Come on, let's go home. And the old horse, with its head down, started off easily, pulling a small wagon with 2 riders behind it. Jake had never ridden a cart before, and so he watched curiously and listened to the singing of the forest birds. Gradually, a drowsiness overcame him.
"Jake! Wake up!" Grandfather Fyodor shouted to the horse, and the horse obediently got up. "Wake up, Jake."
Here we are. Jake Wilson opened his eyes and was surprised to see a small house with 3 windows. It was the nurse's station of the small town of Upwood. Behind the house was a small vegetable garden. "Here's your work, here's your home," the old man said in a low voice. "Look who's here. The 2 front doors are for the hospital, and back there are old doors. You'll go to hut there too." "Thank you, Grandpa." Thank Jake. "How far is the store? Do you need to buy some groceries?" "Who buys groceries?" The old man was surprised. "Do they? People have nowhere to put their money. There's a well as much as you want. Our water is clean and the store is across the street." "How am I supposed to get in?" Jake asked. "There's a key on the door jamb," said Grandfather John Smith. "And so would your father." "I live on that hill over there. What'll it be, Jake?" "All right," said Jake, and went first into the house to put his things away. The doctor's quarters were small. It consisted of 1 room and a small kitchenette with a few simple utensils. There was just enough to live on, and nothing extra. That's how they lived in the village. The length of the news that a young doctor from New York had come to visit them traveled with the speed of light. In half an hour, the locals started coming to the medical station. Some were carrying potatoes, some homemade sausage, some milk and sour cream, some baked goods, or eggs in a basket. Everyone wanted to get acquainted with the new doctor, in whose hands their health and lives would be from this day on. "Oh, what a young man," was heard from the crowd that gathered behind the fence of the medical station and watched the new doctor wash himself from the hand basin. "Why are you standing in the street? Hello?" An elderly woman came out ahead of the city. "We have come to say hello to the new man. My name is Granny. And you, Jake?"
Jake wiped his hands with a towel and stared in surprise at the crowd.
"Good afternoon. My name is Jake Wilson. I'm a cardiac surgeon. I was sent here from the capital to help you. Come in, be my guest." The women smiled and were pleased with the welcome. They came in and peered into the dwelling. Jake watched and marveled at the way these people went about their business. Some began to make their beds, others scrubbed the floors, and still others stoked the stove and began to cook the chowder in a cast iron, sticking it in the stove. Also, the aroma wafted through the house, making Jake's mouth water. And the chowder was so good that no restaurant could compare. By evening, everyone had gone, leaving Jake alone. Now he could think it was going to be difficult. My mind was racing with thoughts of how much I'd have to learn. I don't even know how to make a stove. What's the point of having one in the city? Although, how am I supposed to cook food? I'll have to buy an electric stove. And in the winter, I'll learn, Jake thought. His thoughts were interrupted by a cautious knock at the door. "Come in, it's open," he said. The door opened, and a pretty girl of about 25 came in. She didn't come empty-handed either, but brought a basket of pies. "Good evening, Dr. Wilson. And I'm Mary, the nurse. Everyone knows me here," she smiled.
Jake immediately remembered the words of John Smith's grandfather.
"Nice to meet you, Mary. Then we'll work together. Come on in. I'll manage the samovar over tea and conversation." The time passed quickly. It's long gone dark outside the window. "But I've got to go," Mary said. "We've been talking too much. I'll see you on Monday. Why don't I walk you home?" "It's kind of like this. Who's going to hurt me? Everyone here is a friend," she laughed. "This isn't the city." Jake wanted to go for a walk, so he volunteered to take her home. It was warm outside, smelling of fresh leaves. He felt like he was in a fairy tale world, or even a dream. Jake noticed that Mary was looking at him with a fondness that meant sympathy on her part, but he could offer nothing in return, for his heart still ached at his fiancée's betrayal. For Mary herself, the new doctor was a dream come true. She couldn't find a better match. Besides, he was a handsome, intelligent young man, which also meant a lot. She'd seen how respectful people talked about Jake, and it made her proud. She wanted to be a part of that too, and so a simple plan to marry the doctor to herself as soon as possible had matured in the practical nurse's mind. After Jake saw her off, he stood for a while on the bank of the river that ran nearby. The village was asleep and only one house had a glimmering light. It was Grandpa Frank's insomnia. This Monday morning brought Jake back to reality. Before the sun had even risen, he was awakened by the roosters preparing to go out on his first day of work in the settlement. He heard some grumbling. It turned out there was already a line lined up for the station, which in addition served as a gathering place for gossiping women to scratch their tongues. Upon seeing the doctor in a strict suit, the line suddenly fell into respectful silence. Everyone stared at the new guy. "Good morning," Jake greeted everyone, one at a time. "Hello" came from everywhere. But 10 minutes later, there was a scuffle in the crowd. Somebody wanted to jump the line.
He even had to go out and call for order, because no one was going to listen to Mary. It turned out to be a lot of work. The habitual company of teenagers was extremely neglected, and most of them had not had a fluorography for years. In addition, dispensary for a long time, no one has not been engaged in.
What was the last doctor doing here? Jake resented him. Why is the file cabinet in such bad shape? Mary, you can do whatever you want, but all the data must be entered into an electronic database so that the doctors in the region can see the patient's medical history. Do you understand? Otherwise, we're going to have a fight on our hands. I understand, Jake. Mary smiled. You made me sound like we've been married for 10 years. Well, I'm sorry, Jake said. For some reason, some doctors think that if they work in the countryside, they can be negligent about their work and their patients and not keep up with the times. I know a lot of well-known experienced doctors who are still studying. So far, they have graduated from various courses and studied new scientific achievements. But don't rural people deserve quality treatment, worse than urban people? An elderly woman, who was at the reception at that moment, looked at the new specialist with inspiration and absorbed his every word. You know what Elizabeth said in line when she left the office? The new doctor has for us, ordinary people, hurts with all his soul worries. And he's so young, but he's talking. Oh, how he started to point out our little irregularities, saying that something was wrong, came from the queue. And the villagers were convinced that Jake was the best doctor in the world. And he'd been sent here for the truth. The week flew by, and Jake was fully immersed in his work, not noticing how the cat was changing the evening. The lines were getting shorter, the house calls fewer. It was time to plant gardens. So people's ailments receded into the background. One evening late already, in the door of the house, someone hesitantly knocked.
Who's come through the door in this rainstorm? Jake thought grudgingly, but then he remembered that there wasn't a single doctor for 20 kilometers around. So he pulled himself together. It was his profession. He chose it.
Jake opened the door. A stranger stood before him, drenched to the skin. She was sobbing. He couldn't tell if she was crying or if it was the rain streaming down her face on the floor, carefully woven and presented by Elizabeth's grandmother. The guest stood on the threshold and was silent. The master of the house was silent as well. "I am sorry to disturb you at this hour," she began with a trembling voice. "But it's a matter of life and death." Jake realized she was crying and motioned for her to come in. "Who are you?" he asked. "My name is Carrie," she said. "I came here unnoticed, or they'll gossip. Ours can throw stones, and there is enough shame." Carrie cried again, and Jake handed her a handkerchief. She frantically crumpled it in her hands. Jake realized that this was a serious matter. "We're not in the office, so I suggest we talk informally as friends," Jake said. "Okay," Carrie agreed.
Jake handed her his robe.
"I'll go to the kitchen and make some tea because you're soaking wet. It's still chilly in the house. I didn't heat the stove today." While he was in the kitchen, Carrie rolled up her wet clothes and put on her robe, which, of course, was too big. She looked comical in Jake's clothes, and he smiled. "You're here. Help yourself. There's cookies and candy and meat pies Grandma Elizabeth baked, and then we'll talk, okay?" Carrie nodded and smiled, her pearly teeth showing, a smile that suited her well. Jake watched her absently over his tea. He looked around wearily. "Do you work somewhere?" Jake asked. "Yes, I work on a farm as a milkmaid. I actually studied to be a veterinarian. I love animals. I'm waiting for our vet to retire and they'll hire me to take his place. Everything is going so well and you're crying. What's wrong?" he said. "The thing is, the son of the farmer I work for now cheated me," Carrie said with her head down. "He promised to marry me. When I told him I was pregnant, he told me to get rid of the baby and keep quiet. And he's not going to help with the baby and recognize it as his own either," she said dryly. "So I'm not going to get rid of the baby," Carrie said. It's just that there's no one else to ask for help. You're kind of the authority figure around here. Why don't you talk to Mike Brown, my baby's father? Maybe he'll listen to you, change his mind. I got a sick mom. That's why I'm working in her place, so I can make a living. And when the baby comes, I'll have to leave the farm. We won't have enough compensation for the three of us. So what do? I don't know how I fell for that bastard's tricks. It was like a blur. He's always disgusted me, and now it's as if I've lost my will. And he's never been lovely, like some kind of intoxication, Jake said thoughtfully. That remains to be seen. So wait, what about your mom? He wondered.
Heart's weak, Carrie replied. Constant dizziness, weakness. She was in the hospital in town, but the doctors said they couldn't help her. Prescribed some pills for heart palpitations. They sent her away, and they don't give her disability.
You could lie down and die, Jake said. So tomorrow morning, bring your mother to my office. We'll do a cardiogram, get her looked at. Send tests to the city, Jake suggested, with the baby. Maybe I can help you if the dad doesn't come to his senses. You gotta fight for your happiness. You understand, don't you? Carrie smiled. I understand, thanks. I feel better now. It stopped raining and she left, asking not to be escorted out lest she started gossiping. Jake lived, fighting the stress, went to bed. Needed to build up his strength. It was going to be a tough day. Carrie brought her mom. Linda Johnson was pale and could barely move on her feet. There was no one around this morning, so Jake was able to get a good look at the patient and do the tests that were available to him. When he found out what Carrie's mother had been treated with, he was indignant. The regimen is totally wrong for you, Linda. Is that why you feel so bad? These drugs seem to have been prescribed at random without the proper tests. So here's what we're going to do. You're going to remove all the medications and stay on bed rest for a week, and I'll prescribe you some drops. They're inexpensive. You take them for now, and when the results come back, I'll prescribe you something else. It's not that bad. We'll see. Maybe you'll be able to go to work soon. It's just the effects of age-related changes, and your body wasn't ready for it. That's why it reacted so violently, Jake explained. Mother and daughter looked at each other. They both had tears in their eyes. You could see how worried and anguished they had been all this time over some medical malpractice that had nearly driven a nearly healthy woman to her grave. Doctor, yes, next to you. I even feel better somehow, Linda exclaimed. I was really going to die. Her tears streamed from her eyes. Carrie looked at her mom and burst into tears. She hadn't told her mom she was pregnant yet, afraid of giving her a heart attack. I realized this and decided to help. So that's it then, he declared. In 6 months, you can safely work as a milkmaid or a nurse and there and babysit a grandson. The time will come. What do you mean, a grandchild? Rounded Linda's eyes. Mom, I'm pregnant with Mike Brown's baby, and he doesn't want one. Carrie lowered her head. Her mother's face frowned, but then suddenly brightened. Well, screw him. I'll be on my feet soon enough. We'll raise a granddaughter someday. All thanks to our golden man, Jake Wilson. If your father were alive, he'd give that Brown guy a hard time, Linda said through her tears, winking off into the distance. Carrie came out without a limp. It was like she'd been given a new lease on life. That's what moral support means, Jake said. It's important to patients. I don't know how to thank you. I shook Carrie's hand. I was so scared for my mom, and I was scared she'd find out about my situation. It's embarrassing. I'm not married, and now that she's cheered me up so much, I can't be bothered. Oh, how nice of you to come to us. Carrie gave Jake a big hug out of sheer exuberance. He could feel her heart beating. Something fleeting, tender touched his soul. It was like falling in love. And even though this girl was nothing like his sophisticated ex-fiancée, she doesn't play the piano or wear beautiful clothes. But in all of that, you can see her bright soul. I don't expect anything in return. When Carrie was leaving, or I was still watching for a long time, if he didn't understand, Mike, how could you offend such an angel? Farmer Brown's house was a real mansion. When I walked into the backyard, I saw that the owner's family had servants in addition. It was all in the style of a manor house. Some women and men either carrying something or washing and cleaning. So rich, I thought truthfully. Linda Johnson said on the steps of the mansion sat a young, full-bodied man with sideburns, Mike Brown with the same hair and the same eyebrows. His small eyes were watching the laborers. He looked more like an angry pig. Afternoon. Is that you, Mike? Jake asked. I'll take care of you, Doctor. His eyes jumped before he showed up. We don't have any sick people. I'm here about Carrie's situation. She said you got her pregnant. She wants to keep the baby, and it turns out you're against it. What's the matter? You can't handle your own baby. That's none of your business, doctor. Mike stood up to his full height, revealing a decent beer belly. Not really my thing. If she's pregnant, I'm the only doctor in the area. So you don't recognize the baby too. Jake didn't want to deal with that unscrupulous bastard anymore. Right off the bat, Mike chuckled. Vaughn would be happy to marry me with the kind of money our family has. It's a dream come true for them. We're not talking about marriage now, but about responsibility for the baby, Jake said. Will you admit paternity? No, I've already said it. Whoever she complains to is the one who's going to feed her now. Okay, Jake said. He turned and walked away. He realized he had nothing more to say to this man. Lunch was coming to an end, and he hurried to the nurse's station. It was Children's Day, so there were moms and babies gathered in the hallway. Mary was already hard at work, weighing, measuring height, and handing out preventive immunization handouts to moms. Well done, Mary. You're doing a great job. Jake praised the nurse. Why were her cheeks flushed? Scarlet? She looked coquettishly at the doctor and smiled at him as if she had the face of a mature beauty. The Marys in the line were whispering about her and Jake's relationship, and there was a need to spread the rumor that the new doctor in town and the local nurse weren't just colleagues. Jake Wilson didn't notice the intrigues and love nets that the girl was carefully setting up. He plunged headlong into his work. In the evening, when he stoked the stove and cooked soup himself according to the recipe of a local resident, Carrie came to visit him. I'm sorry I didn't knock, she said, and cried. What's wrong with you and Mom? Is something bothering you? Jake asked. I got fired. Sobs. Carrie came to the farm today. And Mike told me and Mom not to go in their barn. I got my paychecks, my workbook. How are we going to live now? All right, you'll live. You can't stop crying. Jake started to calm her down. Everything's going to be all right. That bastard Brown can't wait to humiliate you. I've been needing a custodian and a cleaner for a long time. That's 2 full-time jobs. I think you and Linda Johnson are good enough. We'll get you signed up tomorrow. While your mom can't work, I'll give her sick leave. You'll do the cleaning for her, and I'll help out, of course. Mary's been working too hard. Those nurses work too hard at their jobs. Carrie stopped crying, wiped her tears, and smiled radiantly. Really? Are you going to help us? Are we going to have everything like people? Of course, Jake confirmed. Don't forget to bring your mom to the reception. In front of you, Carrie ran out of the room. She couldn't wait to tell her mother the good news. She was elated. That's how simple words of encouragement and a little help can lift a fallen person. Jake Wilson knew this well because he was a good... What can't be said about Mike Brown, who, upon learning that Jake had helped Carrie's family, held a grudge against him. The treatment Jake prescribed for Carrie's mom, according to research, worked great. After 2 months, she was able to get off sick leave and work at the nursing station with her daughter. As Carrie's belly grew, the hopes of the township matchmakers to marry her dwindled by the day. Mary saw from the sidelines how tenderly Jake looked at Carrie, and his feelings were mutual. Linda Johnson surrounded the doctor with care, gratitude, and simply because this John Smith, as she called him behind her eyes, was to her liking. Soon, everyone in the township found out that Carrie was pregnant, but they didn't know by whom. Everyone who knew about it was silent as a partisan. So the local women wondered who the mysterious father was. Rarely any decent girl gets involved with anyone. Reasoned one of them, standing in the village. Then why doesn't she marry? AI? Questioned another. Is it the doctor's fault? Asked an old woman. This aroused the anger of the crowd. What are you talking about, Semyonovna? The doctor is a good fellow. He wouldn't dishonor a girl. And look, with your chick in mind, she's got a lot of time on her hands. And Jake Wilson came here only 3 months ago, explained the forester's wife. And it's true, said Semyonovna. I almost gave the fellow a bad name. Then he's married. That's right, Zana concluded. Everyone fell silent at once. Each of them had a husband or a son-in-law. The silence was broken by the forester's wife. Here you aren't, stupid garden head. You're having second thoughts again. Carrie wouldn't get involved with just anyone. It's someone who tricked her, who messed her up. I guess they did. If I find out who, I'll break his windows. It's becoming a fashion for him to hurt orphans. I was my father Ivan's friend once. We must help the girl." The next day, the women from the village came to Carrie's house and moved what they could. Some brought a crib in which all the children had grown up, some a high chair, some a children's table, and some clothes for the babies. They even brought a tricycle and a soccer ball. That really touched Linda Johnson. It turned out to be a whole holiday with songs and sitting till night. Autumn crept up unnoticed. While harvesting carrots in the vegetable garden, Carrie went into labor. She was rushed to a nearby maternity hospital in the district center. Carrie gave birth to a baby boy, whom she named after her father, Alexander. "Daddy, here's your baby boy," the midwife said as she brought him out for discharge. "He's just like his father, your baby. He looks just like him." Jake looked back at Linda Johnson, who was blushing like a beet. The two of them had come to pick up Carrie together. They'd mistaken him for the baby's father. "Thank you," Jake said, and held out his hands to take the envelope. Little Alexander showed, with a loud cry, that he was no stranger to the world. It wasn't until Carrie got the doctor's note and held his son in her arms that he calmed down. "That's quite a voice," Jake smiled. "He'll probably be an opera singer." Linda Johnson couldn't get enough of her grandson. She took the baby from Carrie, who was still weak and holding the package. "I'm afraid he'll tear up and sing," she said quietly. "I have a proposition for you," Jake said to Carrie. "Why don't you and I register? I'm suggesting it because we like each other, and the most important thing is Alexander's well-being. He can have his father's last name like everyone else." "But it's not your child," Carrie said, surprised. "Wouldn't you regret it? I've liked you for a long time, but I don't want to ruin your life." "No one's saying you're going to ruin my life," Jake said. "Well, do you agree?" "I do," Carrie said shortly. Sobs came from behind them. It was Linda Johnson. The long months of worrying about her daughter were finally over. She was happy, and maybe even happier than the future couple. Like the registry office, they were signed quickly, without delay. And now no one in the village doubted that Alexander was Jake's son. Just born prematurely, that was the rumor among the locals. The newlyweds didn't deny or confirm anything, but just smiled, enjoying their happiness. Everyone was invited to the party to celebrate the creation of a new family. The tables were set right on the meadow. Next, the warm woman's fall still allowed to celebrate until morning. The only two who didn't show up were Mary and Mike. Envy of other people's happiness blinded their eyes. What did drunk Mike say as he passed Mary's house? "Your Jake didn't marry you," he sneered. "I needed my pretty girl, you see." "He's my boy too," Mary said. "He didn't leave me for nothing." "Why didn't you marry me then?" "I wanted to." "What if I'd yelled? Then Jake and I had a good chance." "He's just a fool." Mary wouldn't stop. "Don't scold me," Mike snapped at her. I have a plan for revenge. You want to help? Well," and he fell down on the grass with his mouth shut. 3 days later, a prosecutor's audit came to Kashira. I was shocked when I found out what Jake was accused of. "We've received a signal that you, Dr. Wilson, are taking bribes from patients," the investigator said. "Please open the safe." Larry obligingly handed over the keys. When Jake opened the safe, he found a wad of money. Mary secretly rejoiced, for she had put it there at Mike's request, carefully erasing the fingerprints. All the bills were marked with the word bribe, which showed up under a special lamp. "It's not mine," Jake said in shock. "Then whose is it?" the investigator asked. "You were in charge of the safe, and we know about your history with the missing painkillers. That's why you were sent here. What do you—" "I didn't take anything then either," Jake said. "That's what they all say," the investigator grinned. "Shall we make an arrest?" Jake was taken to the city and put in the detention center. Carrie went to see him with packages and told him that no one in the village believed he was guilty. People raised money for a lawyer, but he didn't help either. The court found Jake guilty of bribery, taking into account the past missing drugs. He was eventually sentenced to 4 years. It all happened so fast, they didn't even get a chance to say goodbye. Jake was shipped 1,000 kilometers from home, and Carrie was left with her mother and baby in her arms. The general security colony in Magadan was considered exemplary, but only on paper. When Jake entered the cell, he immediately realized that he would not be allowed to serve a normal sentence here. No sooner had the iron door closed behind him than a small, nasty-looking convict jumped up to Jake. What kind of bird has flown in? He chuckled, showing his toothless mouth. Jake silently put his things down on the empty bunk and sat staring at a single point. They don't teach you how to say hello, another convict said loudly, cleaning something at the table. Hello, sorry. I'm sorry. I'm very tired after the long trip, Jake replied. There are rules you can't break, said an older man in an expensive tracksuit that made him stand out from the rest of the prisoners. Everyone was quiet when he spoke. I don't know the rules yet, so I'll have to learn, Jake said. Unfortunately, you should have learned sooner. Now, I'm sorry, the locals have taken offense, the man in the suit said. I'll start over. My name is Jake. What's yours? There was laughter in the cell, and someone in the corner whistled. It's not proper to ask such questions of newcomers here, the man said with restraint. And then the doctor realized that he was the chief of the colony, so he kept silent. You can see the doctor right away, commented the toothless man. Will he live with us or will he go to his grave by himself? I don't know anything, Jake said tiredly. He was fast asleep. When he woke up, he found all his things scattered and lying around. Now go get your stuff, doctor. The red-haired, squint-eyed man hopped around him like a monkey. Everybody laughed. Whoever scattered my stuff, let him collect it, Jake said, squirming inwardly, but not letting on. He sat down at the table, where crumbs lay on the table, as the convicts prepared for breakfast. Just as Jake sat down, 3 prisoners approached him. One clamped his mouth shut, and 2 of them tried to pinch his arms. Let's throw him in the toilet. The toothless one yelled frantically. Jake managed to grab a spoon from the table. The military training he hadn't missed at the university was making itself felt. With a swift movement, he threw the redhead over his hip. Then he kicked the toothless one under the breath. He hit the toothless one so hard that he collapsed near the restroom, next to a third man, a large, clumsy man who appeared to be the authority's security guard. Jake grabbed the ambo's throat from behind and put the handle of a spoon to it. Listen, suit, call your handlers, Jake shouted. I'm a surgeon, and I can cut this boar up like this. Are you going to barbecue or ask for more? So pour tea with the doctor, the leader said calmly. Let's get acquainted. The Pacan forbade it, the toothless one moaned. Let him go for his insolence. He spooned us. I'll let quietly answered the older man and narrowed his eyes like a snake. The toothless one poked and crawled away under his bunk. The other prisoner was already pouring tea. Sausage, chocolate candies, and a fruit roll appeared on the table like a tablecloth. Sit down, surgeon. Let's get acquainted, the authority figure said in a tone that brooked no objection. Jake let go of the ambo, who had a trickle of blood running down his neck, and sat down next to the gray-haired man. There was a murmur, but the gray-haired man raised his hand, and everyone fell silent. I had a name too, but here they call me Gray. I call you Surgeon Jake. I'll give up my bunk. The terrorist will sleep across from me now. Some stone-faced man silently gathered up his belongings, rolled up the mattress, and left to take Jake's place. Your stuff my guys will make up for, Gray said. We've got doctors sitting here. Tell me, surgeon, how did you get here? Jake told his whole life, and the men who had robbery and murder to their credit listened with their mouths open. That night, the gray-haired man began to feel sick. He collapsed from the bench, clutching his heart. Jake reacted quickly as the nearest cardiologist was several dozen miles away, and he was entrusted to treat the authority figure. The next day, the gray-haired man was better. Since then, Jake had a life of luxury in prison. He became the authority figure's right-hand man. And Carrie waited and hoped for the best. Linda Johnson had 2 jobs and was the breadwinner for their family. Ashley thanked fate that she had gotten back on her feet in time and cursed the farmer's son for what he had done to Mary. Mary, on the other hand, had quit her job and moved to the city, hiding from the wrath of the people. But trouble doesn't come alone. Little Kyle got sick. His heart was too weak. Does your son need surgery? Not now, but in the near future, said the pediatric cardiologist. And not every specialist will do it. So what do? Carrie pleaded. I'll put Kyle on maintenance therapy, but the drugs would be expensive, the doctor said. When Carrie found out how much the drugs cost, she burst into tears. She'd never seen money like that before. God. Linda Johnson splashed her hands when her daughter told her what the doctor had said and that there was no one to help us. Jake's in jail. And that evening, the state prison called. We regret to inform you, Mrs. Wilson, that your husband, Jake Wilson, has been killed in a logging camp. He was crushed to death by a log. We're sorry for your loss, the other end of the line said, and hung up. Carrie felt the ground slipping from under her feet. The light faded in her eyes. No sooner had she been a wife than she was a widow. Linda Johnson was especially grieving. Jake was like a son to her. The rumor that Carrie's son was seriously ill and her husband had died in prison reached Mike Brown. One night there was a knock on the door of Carrie's house. Mike stood on the doorstep, wiping sweat from his forehead. I'm not made of stone either, he said. I know people grumble at me saying I need more. I don't have to live on nothing. Come into my house and I'll recognize you as Wilson. I'll help you with your treatment. Why don't you say something? Think about it. You'll pay your debts. If you live with me, I'll give you money for your medicine. And if you don't, I'm sorry. Mike left and Carrie cried all night. She didn't want anything to do with the hated farmer's son, but the child's life was more precious. Daughter, don't go. People will help and cure Kyle, her mother begged her. We can't get that much money and he's rich. Let them help cure their grandson, Carrie said. Nothing comes easy. I'm sorry, Mom, but I agree. I can't bring Jake back anyway. At least it'll save my son. Linda Johnson was silent. There was only one person who didn't believe in death, and that was Mary. She filed a request on behalf of Carrie's wife, where she learned that it wasn't him who had died, but his full namesake and his insidious jealousy. A plan matured. She wrote a letter to Jake, telling him in color that his wife had gone to live with Mike, and she kept quiet about her son's illness. Why are you being so quiet? The gray-haired man asked Jake, who was holding the unfortunate letter. Eventually, I have to go home. Jake answered briefly and showed Mary's letter to the boss. Well, that's the way it should be, the gray-haired man replied. In 3 days, there will be an escape. You can go with them, and I'll cover you. And if they catch you, they'll bring you back to my cell. I'll make a deal, the gray-haired man assured him. Jake lay awake. He wondered how Carrie could do this to him. The convicts were running at night. The gray man had it all figured out. A freight train loaded with food arrived right on schedule. Some man was waiting for them. He helped them get into the carriage, which was equipped for 4 people. How much it cost the 7th, we could only guess. But in 3 days, the fugitives, led by Jake, were in his village. Let's rob a store, the redhead suggested. We'll just kill the clerk, or she'll give us away. We won't kill anybody and we won't rob anybody, Jake objected. Go on your way. I'm going home. But the convicts wouldn't listen. It was their old habits to enter the store at lunchtime, not to scare Zoya, the saleswoman, to death. But they didn't have time to hurt her. Run, Jake shouted, and he rushed at the bandits, 2 of whom he managed to disarm, but the third crept up behind him and hit him on the head. If it hadn't been for the men Zoya had brought with her, Jake would have died. Look, Jake's alive, shouting all around. Carrie ran to the screams, but she didn't get to see her beloved. One thing made her heart glad that Jake was alive, but she was ashamed of him and of people. The thought of the sick child, however, kept her from leaving Mike Brown. As the gray-haired man had said, Jake was returned to the colony, who would be in the cell, but not only did they not add time for escape, but after a year they released him on parole for good behavior. For me, said the gray-haired man in parting, Jake was finally free and breathing the fresh summer air. When he got back to town, the first thing he did was go to the truck stop. What are you doing here? Don't mess with us. We'll get out of here. I'm selling the farm. How are you going to leave? You have my wife and son. Jake pushed Mike away and headed toward the house. Let's go home. It's not your fault. When Carrie saw Jake, she grabbed her son and ran out of the house like she was barefoot. He hugged them, and then he turned around and punched Mike Brown in the face. He fell and couldn't get up for a long time, and Linda Johnson came running toward them. Jake, you're back. Oh, Carrie, I was held hostage by that asshole. Sashinka's sick. His heart's weak. Jake looked at Carrie, she said. I lived like a servant. I didn't cheat on you, I believe you, Jake said. Let's go home. And outside Carrie's house, the whole village had gathered. People were coming, carrying treats, congratulating Jake on his return. Jake's arrival party was a village-wide celebration. A week later, Notary John Smith arrived. I've come to transfer Mike Brown's former farm to you. How's that? Jake didn't understand. It's being given to you. By whom? Vladimir Pokrovsky. Remember him. You saved him in New York when you worked at the clinic? By the way, Kyle, who set you up with the missing drugs, is serving time for trafficking in illegal substances, and your grandfather is the handiwork of the same Pokrovsky. So take possession of the farm. Sure, Jake smiled. And 6 months later, his enterprise was one of the most profitable in the region. The workers on it were making decent wages. Carrie became the head veterinarian, and the whole farm was skillfully managed by Linda Johnson. Sasha was operated on in the best clinic in the capital, and he ran with all the children and no longer choked. Jake succeeded in getting a full-fledged hospital with a hospital and a maternity ward built in the village. Jake Wilson became a hero to the entire female population. The older men called him our Jake. They always guarded the welfare of his family. Mike Brown and Mary, who had returned from the city, were dishonorably banished from the township. In addition, Mike was tried for using illegal drugs. Carrie, on the other hand, was always by Jake's side. One day, Carrie suddenly became dizzy. Jake barely had time to pick her up and was very frightened. "We need to go to the hospital right away," he said. Carrie smiled. "It'll pass. Don't be scared." When Jake asked fearfully, 9 months later, she whispered in his ear, "We're going to have another baby." And time went on in a new way for Jake. "I guess Ben is going to propose today," thought Kate, and stretching with pleasure, she rolled over on her stomach and raked the pillow that still held the scent of her departed lover and buried her face in it. She knew she was so lucky. And how could she not be happy when your boyfriend was a handsome sheriff's brother who promised to fulfill the dream of American life for you in a house in a respectable suburb behind a white picket fence with 3 kids and maybe a pet Saint Bernard? Ben had promised that everything would happen. He would soon save enough for them to move into their new and shared home. Her parents, Kate thought lazily, had never dreamed of such a thing at her age. They, who had won a green card in the 90s, had come to the United States with literally 2 suitcases and high hopes instead of seed money, a math teacher, and an engineer. They were willing to work hard and stubbornly pursue their goals. But it wasn't that simple. 3 times Anastasia and Vincent found themselves on the verge of bankruptcy. They had to live in a trailer park eating out of a food bank. They had to humiliate themselves and take things from charity funds for their daughters. His mom still never tired of repeating how much it hurt her and her father's pride, but they survived. They rose to a confident middle class and now lived on the West Coast in a small house on the coast. Memories of her sister came to mind acutely, suddenly, and at the same time. So naturally, Kate sat up on the bed and shook her head, groaning unhappily. All right, that's enough. On this wonderful morning, she would not think about the past. Enough. But the past, no matter how hard she tried to run away from it, didn't want to let go. And it hurt Kate to imagine what her parents were still feeling, because losing a daughter was, of course, a much more horrible experience than losing a sister. Maggie's been missing for 5 years, missing under circumstances that simply did not allow for hope that one day she would be found alive. And yet, Kate and the girl's parents believed, desperately, with anticipation in every moment for the first 2, with a wistful hope that there was room for happy miracles in the world. The next year. In the 4th year, their faith was based on guilt, that they, as kinfolk, simply had no moral right to think Maggie dead until the body was. And then, as the 5th year went on, everyone realized it was time to come to terms. Maggie, their bright, kind, pure girl, was just gone. It was as if she'd been cut out of the world, removed, and that was the end of it. Okay, that's enough. Feeling like she was going to burst into tears if she continued to lie like this, Kate hurried out of bed. Tuck her in. Ben is accustomed to strict order. In fact, he had a thing about keeping everything on a ruler and neat and tidy to the max. It wasn't that Kate had been bothered by it, but now, of course, she was thinking that when she became Miss Kane, she would have to work hard to keep the house in order. What order? Even Ben's cans of beans and other canned goods in the kitchen cupboards had to be labeled in the same direction. Matthew, Ben's brother, had once delicately hinted to Kate that this was not a mental disorder, but rather a psychological problem that a 30-year-old forehead had no reason to fight. "I won't," Kate replied cheerfully. "I'm not without sin myself," she added with a smile, and Matthew grinned back and nodded. He knew that Kate was hysterical about snakes, hated clowns, and could change her clothes 10 times to choose what to wear because she was in one outfit or the other, but she thought she had a bad figure. It hadn't gotten to the point of moving in with Ben, so Kate had to make do with the clothes she'd picked out of what she'd hastily thrown into a small bag, and she'd chosen a denim skirt and a pink t-shirt with a picture of a unicorn chewing gum. It was probably 30 degrees outside. She thought unhappily as she opened the windows in the living room and kitchen for air. She decided to do a big cleanup. No, Ben hadn't asked her to do that, but she decided to surprise her lover by showing him what a hostess she was. Ben had said yesterday that he was going to the supermarket for his monthly big shopping spree, but when he got back, they'd have half a day free. Perhaps, thought Kate, sweeping the kitchen floor, they could cook dinner together. That would be so romantic, something Italian. Seafood pasta, perhaps. Mrs. Kane, Kate said aloud, as if tasting her future last name, plumping up the decorative sofa cushions in the living room. She took a keen look at her surroundings. No, he was a good guy, a clean and orderly man, albeit a little manic, but it would be to her advantage as a hostess in the future. And then Kate remembered what Ben had said about taking down the guest room closet. He didn't get many guests, so he used it almost as a storage room, for example, for his inflatable boat and what was going on in the closet. There were boxes of old high school and college awards, more old photo albums, and I don't think there were even boxes from some moving day that hadn't been thrown away. Ben had bought this house 5 years ago, and before that, he'd lived in rentals. Anyway, Ben had said he was going to clean out the closet because he couldn't get enough of this mess, but he'd never gotten around to it. And Kate could imagine what a constant, so to speak, background torment it was for someone like Ben. "Wow," Kate said, opening the doors of the massive, obviously antique closet in the guest room. "You could set up store on the couch in here." Ben had said it was time to give the old stuff to charity, and Kate, sneezing a couple of times from the dust, began unloading winter and denim jackets, hiking boots, board games, some old vases. Just think. And a bunch of all this stuff Ben had had to carry with him when he moved away from his parents. He told her once that his mom wouldn't let him go anywhere without all those important things she thought he'd need someday. "And if we have a garage sale, we'll be millionaires." Kate giggled, looking at the pile of stuff on the floor. Now it all had to be sorted. Just sorted neatly into categories and then let Ben decide where to put it. But before that, she decided to wipe the inside of the closet clean of dust. Done and done. Armed with a rag, she began to rub the crossbar, shelves, side and back walls, and ouch, Kate exclaimed when the back wall crunched at one point under the pressure of her hand, shifting sideways. Kate was afraid she'd broken something. Not that Ben wouldn't forgive, he would understand. He'd been so clumsy himself at times. Just last week, he knocked over a mug of coffee on his brand new laptop. The previous laptop, by the way, ended its life in the same way. And for such clumsy adventures, by the way, coupled with his tall stature, Ben got the nickname Moose in high school. His brother Matt had given him that nickname, by the way, when he came to visit. Kate gingerly touched the wall again, checking to see if anything was broken. Suddenly, the wall slid away smoothly, like a closet door, and behind it there was a dark opening. Catherine frowned. What was it? Some kind of hiding place? She stepped right into the closet and looked inside. There was not much light, but it was clear that it was a tiny pantry. She fumbled with her hand on the wall. Was there a switch of some kind? And a moment later, a light bulb flashed under the stream. Kate blinked. It was indeed a pantry, but an unusual one. Later, there was a table and a chair. On the walls hung maps and some photos. Photos of many people, streets, houses, cars. Catherine frowned. What is this? There was also a rack filled with boxes and individual things, a balloon with artificial snow, a teddy bear, a statue of a reindeer, and there was also a rack with things on hangers. Catherine shook her head and frowned harder. Why make a closet behind a closet? Ben was certainly a weird guy, but this was too much even for him. And why did she feel so uncomfortable in this place? It was as if she'd invaded something that wasn't meant for her and generally prying eyes. And why did it suddenly feel so creepy in here? The girl realized that she was reminded of such maps with photos on the walls, marked with multicolored buttons, and in some places connected by threads. She had seen such things in movies and TV series of detectives. Yeah, her consciousness told her a maniac might have one of these in his lair. But Ben is certainly not a maniac. Kate resented her own thoughts. Why would she even think such a stupid thing? Maybe, well, It's just a hobby of his, strange like the rest of him, and she'd better get out of here and spend the day as if nothing had happened, in the company of her favorite man. And then, if she had the chance, ask him, honey, I found something curious there. Tell me what is it and why. Aha mentally grinned that suspicious part of Catherine's mind which she had already made trouble more than once in her life. And then Ben would close his strong arms around her neck and bury her curious in the past. But now, breathless carcass in the backyard. All right, that's enough. It seemed to Kate that the closet was getting very stuffy, and she turned around and wanted to get out, but her eyes caught the things on the hangers and she froze, slowly and heavily, as in a nightmare when you move and your limbs feel like they're stuck in thickened air. She approached the hanger and pulled one of the things. It was a scarlet silk dress with large white polka dots, a flying silhouette. It looked like it had come out of a fashion catalog from the early 50s. No, it couldn't be her. Kate's brain seemed to desperately refuse to believe what her eyes were seeing. The same dress. No, it couldn't be the same dress. It's just similar. But her hands were already reaching out to check the hem, and there were the initials MP embroidered there. Kate's knees trembled, her mouth opened, but she made no sound. Her sister had a habit of embroidering her initials on things in her closet. How much she had joked about this silly habit of hers and asked why. Why do people sign books in their home library? Maggie answered. So the clothes become all mine. 5 years ago, Maggie disappeared, and people who last saw her said she was wearing this very dress. Her favorite. Catherine's fingers frantically fumbled with the delicate silk, as if it could all dissolve, disappear, revealing only a deception, an illusion, because to believe it was too frightening, too incomprehensible, too confusing, too crazy. And then Kate suddenly noticed a hole on the side of the dress, at waist level from the back. Here it was torn, and here it was stained with something. She brought the material closer to her eyes and shrieked softly, strangled, brown color, as if dried blood. Honey, I'm back. Ben's voice came from far away, as if from another world. Honey, where it was quick to put the dress back on the rack, leaping out of the closet, sliding the false wall door back into place. Kate frantically started throwing things back into the closet. Hurry, but in time. Hi, Ben stood on the threshold of the room, looking surprised. What are you doing, sweetheart? I'm just Tate faked a smile and hoped he didn't see it as the shocked falseness of a man who'd learned too much. I thought I'd help you sort things out. You talk to me. Remember that you wanted to clean this place up. I remember, Ben grinned. But you shouldn't have done that. There's so much junk in here, you don't want to waste a nice day like this. But I appreciated it. Come here, baby, he beckoned to her. I stopped at the bakery and picked up some of your favorite raisin buns. Great, Kate squeaked and followed. In the kitchen, she didn't know how. But she made coffee for herself and Ben, her hands shaking a little, but he didn't seem to notice. Kate devoured the muffin, as if she'd been starving for 3 days. I love it when girls have good appetites. Ben winked at her and Kate almost choked. No, it was a great compliment, of course, because then you wouldn't expect your boyfriend to take you to the gym one day and put you on green smoothies to lose weight. But Maggie had the best appetite of the two sisters, and her parents had even told her off more than once for being so pudgy at 17. But Kate thought it looked great on her. Ben was talking about something, about how he and the boys had gotten a barn from a farmer who was a co-founder of a small construction company. How old Stu had gotten his hound line pregnant again, and now he was running around fostering puppies. And the local vet was scolding him again for being irresponsible because he should have spayed her in time. Maybe. Is everything all right? Ben touched her arm affectionately, and Kate shuddered, jumping up in her chair. I'm sorry, Ben sighed. You don't seem like yourself today. No, it's okay. Kate assured him with more fervor than she should for natural behavior. I just had a bad dream. Nightmares from the past. Kate went to the sink to rinse the dishes. In fact, she dreamed a wonderful dream. How she and Ben came to visit her parents, and she had 3 children, and everyone had a picnic on the beach, and Maggie was with them. Alive and well, and apparently sensing her mood, though he misinterpreted her tense reticence, didn't inquire further, and instead talked about what they should do today. At the same time, the couple sorted through the rest of the shopping they'd brought from the supermarket. What needed to be frozen, Ben put away in the fridge at once. And Kate, casting glances at Ben, thought about one thing. How well did she know the man? Or it would be more accurate to say, How well does she think she knows him? Ben Kane, 29 years old, born in Idaho and moved here to New York State right after he graduated from high school. Moved here to be closer to Matthew, who, by the way, is his half-brother on his father's side and with whom Ben has never hidden it. He has always gotten along better than with his parents and deliberately didn't go to college. Although, according to Matthew, he had a chance, especially if he had gotten a sports scholarship. But Ben, from the age of 12, as they call it, burned to work with wood and, as a result, made a hobby a profitable business. Ben was never married or engaged, and how many girls he had before her, Catherine did not know and did not want to know. But she could guess. A brutal lot, because Ben, although Ben could seem at first impression of a guy modest, shy, a kind of provincial simpleton, in fact, possessed stunning charisma and some just animal magnetism, thanks to which after about 5 minutes of acquaintance people were ready to talk to him on the heart and generally believe, it seems, in everything he says. So they met in the city of Chicago, where Ben came to some important exhibition of construction devices, and Kate worked in a coffee shop there. Actually, she graduated from college as an advertising specialist. She should have been sitting in an office, but somehow they haven't hired her yet. Why? Well, this was such a mini black streak for a young graduate with no work experience, and she had to live on something, so she became a waitress. Salary with tips was just enough to rent an apartment in a remote area of the city and eat burgers and noodles from Chinatown. Fancy clothes, beauty parlors, Fridays at the clubs, and all that good stuff. Forget it, miss. This place was all about surviving, because it would be unthinkable to drop everything and go to my parents. Not that they wouldn't accept a daughter who'd run aground in life. But Kate didn't want to disappoint them more than anything else by turning up on their doorstep a loser for nothing. They'd had enough of one disappointment in their lives. Her sister. That's why Kate never considered her parents' house on the coast as her own. And even when they, selling their common house, in which they raised their daughters, offered Kate her share to give cash, she courageously refused these tens of thousands. And the parents, by the way, although they hid it, but it felt, were glad, and Catherine was glad for them. They are, if you look in the conventional sense, their duty to fulfill the parental duty. Raise their daughters, and then, well, it was time for each of them to go to an independent adult life. And how bitter it was to realize, despite the past years, that Maggie had not had time to fly fully into this adult life from her parents' nest. It was bitter to realize it until this morning. And now Catherine had fear sitting in her chest as if embodied in a piece of ice with sharp edges. Maggie's dress. In Ben's secret storeroom. How did it get there? Hey, baby girl. Ben loomed over his fiancée and reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. So what's wrong? You don't seem the same. Well, it's just... Kate smiled softly and pressed herself against him, rubbing her forehead against his muscular chest, her head barely reaching his armpits, hiding her face because it seemed that he could read everything on it. Sorry, I'm just tired at work, and lived outside the city and farther away from the usual Chicago suburbs. In fact, it was already on the outskirts of one other small town that wasn't far from the countryside. And this was where Kate had come for the weekend for the umpteenth time. I got a call from work saying I had to come back right away. The coffee machine was acting up and we bought a new one, some kind of Japanese wonder. Kate's lies came out of her mouth like hail from a weather cloud. And there's a trainee, and they say they have to fire him because he's a total slacker. They're going to hire a new one, and he has to be trained. And I'm already, an old-timer there anyway. It looks like I'll have to leave today. When she had finished, Catherine looked up at her man. Liar, Ben smiled, and his palms pressed her face against her cheeks, then smoothly and inexorably down to her neck. You're such a liar. Did you think I wouldn't find out you were climbing where you couldn't? Well, that's it, sweetheart. Now you'll know how I punish naughty girls. Your sister was just like that. You want to know what I did to her? Hey, baby. Ben's finger snapped in front of her nose and Kate blinked confusedly. She'd imagined the nightmare scene so vividly that she'd lost touch with reality. Sleeping on the move again. You're obviously overworking in this coffee shop. Ben smiled warmly. Her native, cozy and kind giant named Ben had no idea what she had done, and Kate suddenly felt so guilty for her horrible fantasies. Yes, he had her missing sister's dress hanging in his closet, but there had to be some logical explanation for it. Oh, how she wanted to burst into tears and just ask Ben to explain. that he would tell her the truth, and everything would be fine again, like a year ago, like a month ago, like this early morning. But instead, Kate nodded and promised to take more care of herself. And then she went and gathered her things and left the house and got into Ben's pickup truck. He drove her to her small town station as usual, from where the bus she needed was due to leave in the afternoon. And when Catherine left, Ben looked at the bus for a long time. And then he decided that since he had come to town again, it would be good to visit his brother, and since his girlfriend had left, maybe he should sit down with his brother in the evening, have a glass of lemonade because they were both sober, and talk about when Matthew would decide to build his own house. After all, his wife was 4 months pregnant. If they started now, they could probably finish the house before the baby was born. No, Ben did not understand his brother, who was comfortable living in rented accommodation. But Matthew had always been stubborn, and he could only hope that his wife, Sarah, would talk some sense into him. Matthew accepted the invitation and added that in such an evening, it was necessary to have a good time, especially since his wife was visiting her parents at the ranch, which meant that he would be bored at home alone. The sky gradually lost the colors of the sunset, replaced by inky blackness. And now it seemed that from here, from the back porch of Ben's house, you can observe all the stars of the universe. The brothers talked about building a house, and yes, Matthew said he didn't mind, but he couldn't stand the rush. And first he and Sarah had to figure out what they wanted, what kind of layout they wanted, how many stories, and the location mattered. Sarah loved to garden and garden, so the plot had to be chosen carefully. Well, you'll know by your 50th wedding anniversary, Ben grinned, and then choked on his lemonade as his brother elbowed him in the ribs for joking. When do we expect your first anniversary? I don't know, Ben sighed. You know, I've been asking her that for a long time, but I'm afraid I'll scare her off. You know, modern girls are very independent, and she hasn't even started her career yet. Maybe she wants too much. Ben squinted. Well, in principle, I advised her that despite all those excellent grades at uni, it would be better not to be shy to start small, and they'll give her a chance to prove herself. But I'm afraid she doesn't realize that it's not so easy to get a good position right away. Yes, Matthew shook his head. You've always had a knack for picking the difficult girls. And this one. He stopped talking, taking a sip of lemonade. You mean that she's her sister? Ben broke the silence. Matthew nodded instead of answering. He knew all about it. He'd known from the beginning. And it wasn't to say he hadn't tried to stop Ben. He had, but then kinship brotherhood had taken over. And from then on, Matthew wanted nothing more than to keep Ben's secret life from getting so that no one would find out, and that he keep himself in line sometimes. Because let's face it, in recent years, it's become downright dangerous. You know, sometimes I wonder, Ben fidgeted on the porch. Would she understand if I told her everything? Don't even think about it. Matthew put his hand on Ben's shoulder and squeezed his fingers lightly but firmly. I'm sorry, there are too many people involved in this already. No, and no, believe me. Some secrets are best never told. I get it, Ben said, his head down. It's just that sometimes it's like I feel lonely. Believe me, it's better that way than, well, you know, Matthew waved his hand uncertainly in the air. You know, sometimes I wish I could lock you up. Because, Ben, you're almost 30. Some things, you know, are only good when you're young, when your blood is running wild, and all that fire and foolishness is getting in the way. Anyway, do you promise me that you're in control, that you won't say anything to her? I promise, Ben smiled broadly. Relax, will you? I realize that Kate is a very nice person, but she's not the kind of person I'd tell about what happened to her sister. Not now, that's for sure. I agree. Matthew sighed contentedly, uncorking a new bottle of lemonade. Otherwise, we'd have to kill her. Back in Chicago, Kate, of course, didn't go to the coffee shop and instead got to her apartment as soon as possible. And there, barely crossing the threshold, powerlessly sank to the floor and covered her face with her hands, silently sobbed. She was trembling nervously. She could hardly feel her body, and the world around her seemed little real. No, and no again. This couldn't be true. Her Ben could not be the monster who had taken Maggie's life, who had ripped the most precious thing from their family. However, how else was one to understand the fact that it burst like a burst bubble in a swamp where rotten air lurked, that he kept her sister's dress, tattered and with red-brown marks? Having roared to the point of hiccuping, Catherine scraped herself off the floor and went to the bathroom, where she splashed ice water in her face for a long time, and then, having taken off her shoes, collapsed on the bed and fell into a heavy sleep. And it was no ordinary dream, and not a fantastic sort of nightmare. It was a dream memory of the time before everything had happened, of the shaky time when their family had been together and happy, or as if happy. "You're crazy." Kate watched Maggie spin around in front of the mirror. No, her sister looked amazing in this outrageous outfit. A mini dress of rich red color, embroidered with gold sequins, held on thin straps and with the back open to the waist, through which the dress was decorated with gold chains. The image was completed with stiletto heels and bright evening makeup with Egyptian eyeliner. "Your parents will never let you out like that," Kate said, but her voice was full of admiration and envy. She wouldn't have let herself wear it, or even try it on. "I don't care," Maggie winked at her reflection. "I'm an adult, and I can do what I want. You're only 17, but you're 19, Miss Boring, and you're going to finish college without going to a single party." Catherine just shook her head. Yes, Maggie was right about something. She sometimes felt so disconnected from the fun college life. But on the other hand, how could she think about such silly things instead of studying? That's not how her parents raised her. It's not the way they raised Maggie either. Except it didn't work on her. Maggie, unlike Kate, had grown up to be very bold, sharp-tongued, and uncontrollable. She couldn't, like a good girl, come home at 9 o'clock and not a minute later. She didn't study only for top grades, and yes, her mother literally cut her skirts of inappropriate length and short tops with scissors, but Maggie managed to get money for new ones somewhere. No other way to save money for school lunches, and she was also working part-time, of course, handing out flyers, a secret Kate kept. In general, Kate was sad, because it was because of Maggie recently in the house fiercely sounded scandals. Sometimes it seemed at all that Maggie was deliberately looking for an occasion, or maybe she wasn't. And often, by the way, Kate was on her side. She, for example, thought it was cruel to make Maggie eat an empty celery omelet for breakfast because she supposedly needed to lose weight while the rest of the family ate bacon and pancakes. But the harsh fact was that Kate was usually on the sidelines. No, she could sympathize with Maggie, but then secretly, because, what would happen if she dared support her sister in front of Mom or Dad? Then they'd both be dead. Yes, the fact that Catherine was now in college did not change much for her. For her was still important words of support and guidance from her parents. She still, when she came to visit on vacation, her heart sank if something did something wrong and her mother has not yet said a word. But just through a stern look, that night Maggie still sneaked out of the house, and Catherine until the morning tormented by guilt and inability to say that, no, her sister is not sleeping peacefully in her room. She went out with friends. And in the morning, when Maggie returned, Catherine was sick with excitement. She was just sitting down to breakfast, and Maggie, satisfied like a cat that had eaten a tub of sour cream, stood and listened to her mother reprimand her. And she could see in her eyes that she was not a bit better in her ugly behavior. And she cast conspiratorial glances at Kate, and it made her so unbearably gregarious. And then, one morning, Maggie did not come down to breakfast. "She's gone," Mom said. "Where?" said Kate, yawning sleepily and pouring milk over the cereal in her bowl. "I choose school. A private boarding school, where her behavior will be monitored," Dad said. This came as a complete surprise to Catherine. No, she'd heard something like that. Maggie had said her parents threatened to re-educate her and swore she'd never ever go. "We just talked," Mom continued, "and we decided it was best for her." She agreed. "I see," Kate shrugged. "Why didn't she say goodbye?" "I didn't want to wake you up," Dad said. Catherine shrugged again and sat down to breakfast. She had enough to worry about, after all. She was about to go back to college, and she was already preparing for it hard. She had stayed up late last night and then fell asleep as she had never slept before. Only in the morning something woke her up. I think something dropped downstairs. Probably her father was watching the game late again and accidentally knocked a dish with salted nuts off the table, for example. Kate went back to college, and the whole private school thing was forgotten. But she wondered how Maggie was doing. After all, it was so unusual for her to go to some closed institution, practically, according to her parents, a boarding school for noble girls, like those about which English writers wrote in the 19th century. And at first Kate thought that her sister wouldn't last a month there. She'd go home, well, or expel her. As had happened before, more than one school changed Maggie for her antics. But time passed, said parents reported. Maggie was studying. Everything was fine. No, she wouldn't come on vacation. It wasn't supposed to be, but they saw her once every 2 or 3 months and everything was fine. And then, on the very day Maggie finally turned 18 and had to leave the walls of the school, she disappeared. It was known that she took a bus, but then she got off at a small station for some reason near a town. She had no friends there, nothing, and no one there that could explain this strange act, but it happened. And then, according to eyewitnesses, Maggie simply walked off down a path leading into a national park, or disappeared into it without a trace. The police officers in charge of the case said that although there were no direct signs of violence, but probably the sister was the victim of some crime and the chances of finding her alive one day, almost minimal. They also suggested that she might have gone mad. True. It seemed personally unbelievable to Kate. Yes, Maggie's behavior was not a gift, but she was smart, and even if she was a crazy person but not crazy. Patron didn't notice how she fell asleep, and when she woke up, she found that, first of all, it was a new day, and secondly, that the whole body was so stiff that you could hardly move. The girl sighed. A night of reflection, even though she had slept most of it, had helped her make the right decision. She needed to go to the police. "You'll have to wait," said an officer named Martin. "The detective will be here shortly, but my opinion is that it would be better if you contacted the department that is handling the case." "May, I'd have to go to another state," Kate said. "And he's here. I understand your logic and your situation," Miss Martin shook his head. But you better sit down, okay? Have some water." "I don't need water." Lighting time dragged on agonizingly slowly. But at last the right man arrived. Detective Jerry was a man of African-American descent, about 50 years old. He was dressed in a strict black suit with a white shirt, and the only bright detail was a bracelet on his left wrist, unusually colorful for his image of a law enforcement officer. "My daughter gave it to me," he explained, as if to justify the paltry piece of thread. "She was into weaving, and now everyone was wearing it." He smiled, but immediately became serious again. So, let's go over it all again in order." Catherine told everything. And then she was shocked when Jerry told her that there was no way they could go to Ben's house right now and question him. And there's no way to go into his house. "You see, we need a warrant to search his house, and it's not going to be easy to get one just from you," he said, as if embarrassed by his own helplessness. "But I can send a request to the local sheriff so that he, so to speak, starts to understand the situation." Jerry also said that, theoretically, it was possible to get a warrant, but even for a simple conversation with Ben, they'd have to find out where he was at the moment of Maggie's disappearance. And then, unless they had clear evidence, they wouldn't be able to. "Evidence?" Kate exclaimed. "What proof do you need to believe me?" "I saw it with my miss. Don't worry." Jerry made a soothing gesture with his hand, as if urging Kate to sit back in the chair from which he had jumped up. "And please don't take this personally, but we've already had, unfortunately, situations where, because of a rift in a couple, one of the partners said that the other, are you saying that Ben and I had a fight and I'm deliberately bad-mouthing him?" Kate couldn't get it all out of her head. The fact that she was seen as a hysterical fool, and the fact that the U.S. police refused to help her, and she had heard so many good things about them. They were such heroes in the movies. "Well, I guess I should go," she said, holding on to the crumbs of her personal dignity to keep from crying. Jerry said they'd be sure to gather as much information about Ben as they could, and they'd contact the detectives who'd been investigating Maggie's disappearance. He also advised Kate to stay away from Ben for the time being, just in case, and especially not to ask him anything on her own, because if she was right after all. Catherine, thanking for the help and advice, left, except that she was not going to do what she was told and realized. She must figure out everything on her own, and when she brought and shoved her sister's dress under Jerry's nose, he would only have to agree with her. It was going to take time to get it right, though, as the workdays at the coffee shop were starting, and it would be a few days before she could be at Ben's house again. And how hard that time was for Kate. But she held on. She had time to think about everything, and a whole plan had matured in her head. And so, a few days later, having finally agreed with Ben that she would go back to his place this weekend, Kate was on her way home to pack a few things. She was tense, but she tried to calm down, for Ben was not to guess anything. Kate was so absorbed in herself that she didn't notice the car at all. It was an old car, a white and gray van. It had shown up a couple days ago and had been parked outside the coffee shop where she worked for almost a day, and then it was parked outside the building where she rented an apartment. And certainly, immersed in her worries, Katrin didn't feel a pair of evil, hating eyes following her. "Bad, dirty girl," said the man lurking in the shadows of the alley. He raised his hand and rubbed his neck nervously. He always sweated profusely when it was time not just to watch a girl, to hang around her, or even pretend to be close to her, but to prepare to reveal his true nature to her. "Oh, you bitch." The man exhaled and bared his yellowish teeth in a grin. "You'll find out from me soon enough." When they met, Ben hugged Kate and told her he was happy that she had decided to spend the weekend with him instead of in the stuffy city. "Hey, we could go to the lake and go boating," he suggested. "How would you like that?" "I wonder," Kate smiled, and even kissed him. If she was going to play her part, she was going to play it to the fullest, so that he wouldn't suspect a thing until the very end. And before, by the way, Catherine did not realize that she had such acting skills. "But first, a romantic dinner," she added. "I found a recipe and I want to surprise you." So, Ben sighed, stretching, and in that lazy yet powerful movement, he looked like a wildcat. "I have to go to the store, or will canned beans and a piece of beef stew." "Actually," Kate faked a pout, "I need shrimp, spinach noodles, and parmesan." "Okay, baby," Ben grinned. "Oh, what are you doing to me? Before I met you, I would have had less. I'm teaching you manners and nutrition. One is lucky to have such a smart wife." Ben gave her a playful kiss goodbye. And when the door closed behind him and the engine roared a couple of minutes later, Kate almost burst into tears. It turned out to be incredibly difficult to deceive her favorite man, who suddenly turned out to be a maniac. For some time the girl stood, clenching her temples with her fingers. And then she went to the room with the closet. It was time to act. When Maggie was going out with her friends, she didn't think it would end like this. No, of course, she realized that her parents would be furious, but she also knew that their anger had its limits. When the girl got home between 3 and 4 in the morning, she unlocked the door with her own key, and taking off her shoes, she was going to sneak upstairs like a mouse. If she was as lucky as possible, they probably wouldn't know she hadn't been home at all, or they'd start a scandal right away. But this morning, of course, they gave her a scandal. And Maggie listened patiently to the reproaches, and as if even learned them. But just a couple of days later, she again decided to leave the house. Now she was going to a neighborhood party. She went downstairs quietly, and the clock, by the way, was already 11 o'clock in the evening, but suddenly a light flashed in the living room. Maggie blinked, squinted. Her mother and father stood before her. Their faces were tense, and the next thing Maggie noticed were strangers. 3 closets of the most gangly kind. Mom, Dad. She wanted to ask, what's going on? Who are these people? But then the men rushed to her and the nightmare began. One of them gagged her with a rag. The other one put her hands behind her back and tied her wrists with something, immobilizing her. And then the first one threw her over his shoulder like a sack of potatoes and carried her out of the house. Maggie squealed silently and resisted helplessly, as best she could in the situation. But what could she do? Only stare with widened eyes at her parents, who were watching all this calmly, maybe with a tinge of sympathy, but they certainly weren't going to save their daughter. By some miracle, Maggie managed to free herself from the gag, by which time she was already in the car. "No, what are you doing? Help me." But she was pinned down again. She was held tightly by a big man, and naturally a 17-year-old girl was no match for him. A needle flashed in the other man's hands, and Maggie felt a prick in her arm, after which a sickening weakness quickly spread through her body. She realized she was losing consciousness, and then the car started to move. She didn't know how long they drove like that. At times she seemed to regain her senses, but then she slipped back into a disgusting, viscous, and as if tart sleep. "Mommy," the girl called softly and began to cry. She asked for water. She whispered pitifully, humiliatedly, that she had to go to the toilet. But they told her to shut up and only gave her a second injection. Maggie didn't understand what was happening, just waited to see what she was. Well, probably about to be killed, and then the car stopped. She was carried out in her arms. The walls flashed, the corridors were gray. She was thrown onto a hard bed, and the restraints were finally removed. She lost her senses again. Catherine had already plunged into the bowels of the closet, dumping out its contents to reach the back wall, when suddenly she heard the sound of a car pull up. Her heart skipped a beat. It was Ben back. He must have forgotten something. She flew out of the room. If he'd forgotten, he'd take it and drive back. Except the car in front of the house wasn't Ben's, it was his brother Matthew's. "Oh, hello." Catherine smiled so big that her lips ached. "Ben's not here. He's at the SPAC when the girl had been in Chicago on the police force." She had wondered if she should have gone to Matthew first, but she'd been scared for a moment. They were brothers. What if he wouldn't believe her either? But now she felt a wave of confidence. If she showed him the creepy closet, Matt would have no choice but to believe her. "I have to show you something." Kate blurted out and grabbed the sheriff, who was clearly stunned, and dragged him into the house. "I'm sorry. I know you love Ben, and I did too, but you have to help me. We have to stop him." "What?" Matt mumbled. "What are you talking about, Katie?" He'd mangled her name in the American way again, but if it had pissed her off before, it didn't matter now. There were more important things to do. There. Now, Kate flew into the room in a mini hurricane and rushed to the closet. Here. This is where he kept his trophies. She slid aside the false wall of the closet, opening the pantry, turned on the light and froze. Stared, because the pantry was completely empty. No maps on the walls, no pictures, no belongings, and the dress was gone too. Catherine slowly turned back around to Matthew, because she heard something, a quiet chuckle, and now she saw it, a grin on his lips. And Kate broke into a cold sweat at the realization. Matthew knew everything. He knew who Ben really was. "Hey, new girl." No. Someone gently shook Maggie's shoulder. "Wake up, come on." She groaned pitifully, struggled to get her eyes open, and in her first instinctive movement, jerked to the side and immediately banged her head painfully against the wall. She rubbed the back of her head. Maggie realized where she was, in a room. 2 beds, 2 chairs, 2 small tables. A closet, too, all furnished very simply. There were windows, as if there were windows, but they were closed and you couldn't see outside. On the edge of her bed sat a girl, a little younger than her, it seems, dressed in a gray suit. Skirt, jacket, and shirt. No, what? Where am I? What's going on? You must be thirsty. The girl asked sympathetically, holding out a glass of water, and Maggie greedily drained it. "My name is Angela. I was kidnapped." Maggie sobbed. "No, so was I," Angela sighed. "I don't remember anyone ever being brought here willingly." "Well, unless they tricked their parents into saying it's just a school." "No, what are you talking about?" Maggie didn't understand, but something was starting to come to her mind, bits and pieces of it. "A reform school," Angela said. A private institution. Or a camp for troubled teens." No, my parents. Maggie shook her head. "Let me guess." Angela squinted. "You've probably heard them talk about how you need to be re-educated, right? Or maybe they even told you they should send you to some boarding school, only once or twice." "I didn't think." "No, they couldn't have done that." "They could." Angela cut her off harshly. Believe me, they could. It costs a hell of a lot of money to study here. So your parents thought very carefully before they sent you here. I want to leave." "No. They signed papers saying they trust us to be our guardians until we come of age." Angela waved her hand. "It kind of becomes the school and its staff." "How long do you have to stay?" "I'll be 18 in 7 months." "Lucky girl. I'm still only 16, but I was an honor student in high school, and here. I don't know if they'll let me graduate before the others, or if they'll marinate me until I'm of age." "Okay, I gotta get you cleaned up." With these words, she went to the closet and came back with a set of clothes, the same as her own. "Go wash up and change your clothes." "Do you have any piercings?" she asked sympathetically, and Maggie shook her head in the negative. "That's good." Or they could have ripped it out, and it was unclear whether Angela was joking or telling the truth. "Come on. You'll soon be taken to the principal. He'll tell you about the rules here. We'll live together. The curriculum is normal. Well, almost. Girls aren't allowed to play sports here, but they teach us cooking and obedience, and there are also chastity lessons. Well, don't pay attention. The most boring ones you can fall asleep on. The main thing." Angela put her hand on Maggie's shoulder. "To be obedient. And be patient. Believe me, one day we'll get out of here." Except Maggie wasn't ready to be patient or obedient at first. She couldn't understand how her parents could do such a thing. So she was brought to the principal's office and told him they had no right to keep her here. "One more word and you'll go to the punishment cell, doll." "Yes," said the principal. a full, bald-headed man puffing shamelessly in the presence of his ward cigar. "What the hell are you doing?" Maggie shrieked, jumping up from her chair. "This is America. It's a free country, and I'm a free citizen of it. You have no right. I'll sue you. You'll pay me $1 million for what you're doing." "And this is Utah, doll," the director grinned, but his eyes now looked at Maggie in a way that sent a chill down her spine. "And believe me, with a little good parenting, you'll never tell anyone anything, ever. You think you're the first one who's ever been a hound? Believe me, we've had hundreds of kids go through us, and we've returned them all to their parents, a different person. Security." The director shouted in a bass voice and added, when strong guys in uniform burst into the office, "Put the little shit in the punishment cell. 48 hours, just water and some pig food." Maggie had been in the shoe for 24 hours. Dark, cold, empty, a concrete box. She came out, choking on tears and snot, and begging for no more torture. But after 3 days of seeming submission, but in fact intimidated submission, again began to rebel. In general, Maggie, though she did not seek it, but quickly gained some fame among the inhabitants of the closed school, because she was punished more often than others. And only one person surpassed her in this, a boy named Roger. He, too, was 17 and had been sent here after his father's death by his stepmother. Sometimes it seemed as if Roger was deliberately seeking punishment just to annoy his near prisoners. "You can't break me anyway. I'll roll you into a scone and throw it down the Gooston," laughed as the two men dragged him to the holding cell. This was witnessed by Maggie, who was just being dragged out of the punishment cell. She also saw that one of the men had a bruised nose, and Roger winked at her, saying, "Look how tough I am." The boys and girls lived in different buildings, but they studied in the same classes, and gradually, somehow unnoticed even by themselves, Maggie and Roger developed a special bond. They could exchange glances that were imperceptible to others, and that were so telling to themselves, at times at nightmarish risks, they even managed to pass notes to each other. But still, no matter how brave Maggie was, and as time went on, she began not that she was breaking down, but somehow ashamed of her position. Her parents had visited her only 3 times during her time at the school. The headmaster had assured them that too much contact with her family was detrimental to the educational process. And Maggie, she could not explain to herself why it was so, but only at the meeting with her parents she spoke as if she were reading a piece of paper. Yes, she was studying. Yes, everything was good. Yes, everything was normal. However, these meetings were always in the personal presence of the principal and a couple of other people, including Mrs. Lillian, the person in charge of the punishment system. That's why Maggie kept her mouth shut. She was afraid her parents wouldn't believe her, and she'd get it when they left. Only once, 2 months before graduation, on their last visit, did Maggie make up her mind. She silently lifted the sleeve of her jacket, showing the red marks on her arm. The marks from the straps they'd tied her with in the hospital when she dared to deliberately poison herself with some berries. Just enough to make her nauseous, give her a rash, and allow her to skip classes. Her parents rounded their eyes, and Maggie was about to open her mouth to say, "Help, I'm being tortured here. Can't you see that?" But the principal intervened. He'd noticed too. "I have to apologize," he said, and he looked like a man who could be trusted. We didn't look after your girl. During the riding lesson, she got her hand tangled in the reins. We were afraid she would break everything. I understand if you want to take her away immediately and terminate the contract, as well as sue and demand moral compensation." "No, I don't." Maggie's mom shook her hands. "Your school has such good reviews." "No, we won't." "They're teenagers," she smiled. "They're always getting bruises and scrapes, aren't they?" Maggie's father only told her to be careful and sternly remarked that that's why she'd been sent here. To keep her safe, because she'd behaved so badly in the past that she was asking for trouble. Then her parents left, and Maggie was punished. One day she was going to meet Roger, secretly in the garden behind the school's outbuildings, but he didn't come. But instead of him came a girl, red-haired Maggie, who, by the way, was here because she had allegedly done something to the new wife of her millionaire father. So, once again, it was the evil stepmother's fault. It was on this basis, the similarity of life's hardships, 13-year-old Maggie, and became a loyal friend of Roger and played for him, and Maggie the role of liaison, passed notes and verbal messages. "They've taken him away," she whispered the news. "Where?" Maggie was frightened. She might have believed, given Roger's insolence, that the headmaster would decide to get rid of him altogether. I don't know. Maggie looked around apprehensively. But in the middle of the night, a motorcade came. Some people showed the headmaster some papers and took Roger away. Anyway, he's gone. And he didn't tell me anything. Maggie asked. Actually, there is something, said Maggie uncertainly. He said to just wait. That one day it would... What's that supposed to mean? I don't know, Maggie said. It's all very mysterious. Maggie spent the rest of the time before graduation in an extremely depressed state. So depressed that her mentor's torturers even began to think that perhaps she had finally come to her senses. And Maggie, without any additional coercive measures, on the eve of graduation, in the principal's office, with her own hand and under his dictation, wrote a letter of thanks to her native school, where she described how nice it was to live here and assured that she had no claims and undertook not to disclose any information. And then the girl put on her favorite dress. Her parents had given it to her. She left the school and took the bus. She was supposed to just go home, but suddenly she got off the bus, and after that she disappeared. Catherine, looking at Matthew, realized the meaning of the expression about the soul going to the heels. What is it? Matt looked into the pantry closet with feigned surprise. Well, the house was old and Ben didn't need it, so he decided to block it off with furniture. And the closet, by the way, belonged to the previous owners of the house. There are even documents for that. So, oh, Katie, he clucked his tongue. I'm afraid we'll have to have a serious talk about everything. Catherine swallowed hard. Something told her that the conversation would not be pleasant, and that it would be even worse when Ben returned, grabbing the lamp. It was an antique with a lavender shade. Kate didn't think that it was dangerous to hit someone on the head like that, and then, with a short swing, hit Matthew in the temple, and when he fell to the floor, shrieking and clutching his head and face, she ran out of the room, going out of the house. She had come in Ben's car, which meant there was no way to get away from here. Catherine's gaze lingered for a moment on the sheriff's car, but she quickly realized that it was a bad idea, even if she managed to get the keys off Matt's belt when she got back to the house. I wonder, she thought, if he was there, alive at all. But immediately the girl rushed to run. No time to think and linger, we need to save ourselves. Fortunately, there was a road nearby. It was not the busiest, but yes, there were cars passing along it. Kate stood on the side of the road and waved both arms vigorously. May, please, somebody stop. She pleaded to no one as a couple of cars sped past, for some reason, not caring about fellow travelers. But then a car pulled out from somewhere off to the side, around a bend that split the large roads into many small roads. It was an old white van, but one that seemed to be kept in decent condition by its owner. It slowed down beside Kate. Good afternoon, miss. The driver, a stoutly built man of obscure height, for he was sitting now, touched the brim of his baseball cap with his fingers and smiled, flashing his eyes behind the thick lenses of his glasses. Need to go into town, yes. Kate blurted out and almost immediately did not spill everything. That she was fleeing from the house of a maniac and his accomplice, and at the same time brother and sheriff, please. And you. Are you in Greentown? She wondered if her destination was the small town where Matt was sheriff. Kate had no doubt that if she showed up there, she'd be arrested in 5 minutes at the most on the orders of Matt, who'd certainly come to his senses by now for some far-fetched reason. And there, she'd be trapped for sure. Actually, I have to go to Chicago. Kate licked her lips nervously. I can pay. It's no big deal. The driver dismissed her. Actually, that's exactly where I need to go. In a hurry, he asked as Kate climbed into the car and fastened her seatbelt with trembling fingers. Then I think we should take a shortcut. And he turned the car abruptly on the empty road and speeded off in the opposite direction. That is, to the country road from which he had come. But the fact that it was very strange to go back in, that the road to Chicago was in a completely different direction, somehow did not immediately reach to Catherine Simpson. I know all the roads here, said the driver as if reading her confused and, alas, too late thoughts. You have no idea how many young fools vote like that on the roads in the middle of nowhere, and they believe, silly girls, that a good guy will stop next to them. The driver suddenly chuckled, and looking at Kate, wetly smacked his lips. Only I, my girl, am not a good guy at all. The girl's hand was fumbling for the car door handle, and her gaze was stuck to the man behind the wheel. He slowed down, and Kate still had time to think and how he was not afraid of losing control. But he apparently didn't care because he was distracted by the fact that from somewhere under the seat he quickly extracted a dirty rag and a vial wetted, and then pressed it to the face of her companion, who hadn't even had time to scream. Kate threw up her hands, but he was stronger, one hand on her neck, pressing forward, the other with the rag blocking her nose and mouth. A strange, acrid odor hit her sense of smell, and it seemed her very brain. And then Kate, before she could even taste the feeling of overwhelming terror, fell into darkness. He'd seen her a long time ago, and he realized at once that she was an extraordinary girl, not at all like the girls he had seen before, and certainly not like those ordinary girls. It was an overcast, cold day, when it seemed as if all of Chicago had fallen into gloom. He went into a coffee shop to get a latte and a sandwich on special offer because he was used to saving money. Yes, perhaps that was his second problem after lack of female attention. Lack of money. How he had envied all those rich bums, gold-digging dumb guys and gals in his youth who didn't appreciate what they had and squandered their money. Unlike them, he knew the value of every cent. He grew up in a simple working-class family. His father, however, began to drink a lot towards the end and raised his hand at home too often, more often than they all deserved. And Jim, already at the age of 6, realized, by the way, that his father beats him not just there, and for the cause, whips him with a belt with a heavy metal badge not for malicious intent, but because he wants him to grow up to be a decent man. Jim, already at the age of 8, stopped sticking up for his mother when his father attacked her with fists, because he realized that his father does not do it for nothing. His mother is probably guilty too. Jim was never an excellent student, but he managed to get a scholarship and went to college. He quickly realized what he wanted to be, a teacher, to instill knowledge and truths about life and the world around him into the heads of youngsters. And 15 years of work flew by like a day. True, at work sometimes there was trouble. Among the pupils there were sissies who were snotty. They complained, and Jim was reprimanded for his allegedly not pedagogical methods. Hey, what did they know? Jim was convinced that he never punished anyone for nothing, and in general he was still too soft. And then when he was well into his 30s, he was invited to work at a boarding school designed to rehabilitate troubled teens, and Jim rejoiced. At last his talents found a use for them. At last he could do anything he saw fit. Well, almost everything, because there were of course rules, and he wasn't crazy enough to break them and get in trouble with the law, not at all. But even if he eventually reached the principal's chair, above which there was only the board of trustees, which owned this school and a few others scattered in the most loyal states of America. But Jim realized one day it's not enough for him, and then his first time happened. Exciting and unforgettable. Just one day, Jim picked up a girl on the road. They talked, and she bragged that her parents forbade it. But she still ran away from home to go to the concert of her favorite rock band. A dark flame flared up inside Jim. He realized that this young fool needed to be taught a lesson. And looking back later, at first, he was horrified. How had he gotten so far? But then he realized, no, he hadn't gone too far. It's just that some lessons for bad girls have to be just that. There's no fixing them. Can't reeducate them, but it's his duty as an educator to teach them one last lesson. The realization of his own great mission in this world helped him quickly get rid of the fear of being caught, exposed by the police. But like that first time, Jim was no longer in a hurry. Now he chose his victim in advance, looked closely, learned everything about her, and only then proceeded to the educational process. And now on his way met her, Catherine. She smiled so warmly, handing up the order, that he first thought that here, what a pure, sweet girl, a young woman in the prime of her splendor. But then, when he had already moved away from the counter of the cafe, he suddenly heard her talking on the phone. The harlot. She was talking to a guy and going to his place for the weekend. Jim hadn't noticed the ring on her finger. He felt as bad as if he'd been punched in the solar plexus. It was a deafening, bitter disappointment. But Jim realized that there was a world full of immoral girls like that. And he could, in principle, forget about this blonde girl, on whose badge was written the playful name Katie, but something did not give him peace. It took him a few days to find out and realize what it was. He remembered that the parents of one of the girls had shown him their family photos, and there was a picture of Katie. Then Jim put the two together and realized it was the sister of that naughty girl named Maggie. He'd heard the fool had gone missing, but he'd had absolutely nothing to do with it. But now he had a new goal, and he began to plan and wait patiently for the right moment. And now the moment had come. The sky was covered with low, gray clouds. Jim staggered a little, carrying his burden. His back was a problem, and his age was making itself felt. All the men in his family aged early. Exhaling from the strain, he finally set it down on the grassy bed. Then he threw off his backpack and sat down beside her, unzipped it, and started unloading all the necessary things. The forest was quite deaf in this part. There were no hiking trails because it was close to the protected area, and Jim liked to bring silly girls here. Catherine moaned softly and moved. Her head ached. There was a nasty taste in her mouth, and it seemed that her whole body was stiff as after a long sleep. The picture in front of her eyes was blurred, fuzzy, but as it cut across her consciousness, when she saw the man leaning over, What are you doing? No, please. The words came out of her mouth in a weak stream. She didn't know exactly what was happening yet, but she knew it was something very, very bad. She tried to stand up, but she couldn't. Her legs and arms were entangled in plastic ties. It was lucky, she thought, that her hands were tied at the front and not at the back. Otherwise, she would have looked like a beetle tipped on its back by a nasty predator. "You're Maggie's sister," Jim said, not asking, just stating the fact. "Maggie, you." The thoughts in Catherine's head were running fast and confused, but she understood something too well. "No, I didn't kill her and I don't know who did," Jim said before a scream escaped the girl's lips. "I suppose I should introduce myself." He smiled, took off his glasses and put them in his pocket. Without them, of course, you could see worse, but Jim had always felt a little inferior in them, ever since a tough kid in high school had nicknamed him Four Eyes, and for asking him not to insult him, had rinsed Jim's head in the toilet to the laughter of his classmates. "I'm the principal of your sister's school. I was entrusted with such a beautiful flower. That girl had so much potential, but she took a bad path, and you, her older sister, are the same." He smiled sadly. "But, do you know what my secret is?" "Me, please, sir." Catherine did not know how to behave with maniacs. Who would even think about such a thing in advance? But somehow she felt that pleading would not get through to him. "Let me go. I won't say anything to anyone. My secret is that I'm not only a talented teacher, but also the author of my own methodology." With these words, Jim twirled something sharp and shiny in his hands. Kate's throat constricted with choking nausea because well, you didn't have to be an expert on crime stories to suppose that this something sharp and shiny was going to be used on you. Helpless and sobbing, sprawled on a forest floor somewhere in the wilderness. Meanwhile, Jim, in colors, vividly described the essence of his methodology. And Kate, meanwhile, stopped crying because she was absorbed in pure, somehow primal horror. She simply realized that there was something in front of her that had little to do with being human. And she was far from the first to be here, in this corner of the forest near the cliff, the outline of the top of which resembled the face of a grizzly. They're here. They're the other girls. Long dead, fresh and hidden shallowly, and she, according to Jim, it was just under 24 hours before she joined them, which Kate realized with horror promised to be excruciatingly endless for her. As Matt began to come to his senses, he discovered two things. First, a frail, petite Katie had a lot of strength to stun him like that, albeit with a lamp, and he was clearly losing his self-defense skills, and he had been an excellent student at the police academy. The second was his brother's concerned face leaning over him. "Well, what's wrong?" "Katie found your stash," Matt said, managing to suppress the sweary adjective. "And I told you he'd be trouble if anyone ever found out. Now see him." "But what are the odds that someone's going to be poking around the back of someone else's closet?" Ben mumbled, helping his brother to sit up as he moved his senseless body to the living room couch and handed him a bag of frozen broccoli. "We should get you to the hospital." "It'll wait," Matt said, hissing softly as he applied the ice pack to the injured area. She ran away, obviously thinking we were a couple of psychopaths, a maniac and the sheriff covering for him. She could make a lot of noise. She's already contacted the Chicago police, by the way. "No. What?" Ben's eyes widened. "When? Why didn't you tell me?" "I just found out myself this morning. You know, a little birdie told me." "Actually, they don't know much about your story. How did they take it?" "They thought it was a jilted girlfriend getting back at her boyfriend, that's all. But the fact is, now don't be surprised if they start looking at you." "No, don't talk nonsense." Ben snorted, rising from the couch. He used both hands to tussle the hair on his head, which had already grown back into a mound of coal-black curls, and paced the room nervously. I must find her and talk to her. Tell her the truth. I agree. For the first time, Matt said with a sigh, lengths and cities, a brainstorm started when Ben was a 16-year-old boy. In the backwoods of Idaho, where he was from, entertainment was scarce. And so Ben's family feared that one day the adventurous boy would get into trouble. And so in principle, it happened. One fine evening, Ben volunteered to drive around the land that belonged to his family. They kept cattle, and now it was necessary to keep an eye on how and where they grazed and whether coyotes or others violated the boundaries of the land. When Ben noticed the stranger, he wanted to rush home, warn his parents, or at least the hired help. They were tough guys, real cowboys in the coolest sense of the word, but something did not allow him to realize his plan at once. Some vague feeling. He approached the stranger and realized he was wounded. Ben spoke to him and was shocked by what he heard. It turned out that this guy, who introduced himself as Tom, was supposed to be an important witness in the case against the traffickers of disapproved substances, but the cop's car in which he was being transported had been attacked. Tom said that apparently these villains had informants among the local authorities. Tom was afraid he wouldn't live to see the trial, which was to take place in 3 days in a town that was a long way away, and then Ben made a bold, but at the same time, a reckless decision. He decided that he would become a guide for Tom. The thing was, Ben had lost his grandfather a year ago, and while the old man was alive, he had taught him how to navigate the terrain, survive in the wilderness, and many other things. The old man said that among his own ancestors were bounty hunters and other dashing fellows, from whom he had learned the knowledge that is not taught in modern universities and even in your police academies. Tom doubted very much that the green boy would be a good chaperone, but what else was he to do? He was very much afraid that they would get rid of him. So Ben left home. In general, he lied that to a friend. He supposedly broke his leg and the girl dumped him, and the refusal from the college came. In general, it would be necessary to support. With this lie, he won exactly a day's head start, and there, of course, he was grabbed. Parents were shocked. Moreover, the locals spread the news about the murdered policeman. Rangers, volunteers, went to look for Ben. They even sent a helicopter and search dogs. But Ben and his companion could not be found. And then they showed up in that town, right on the day of the trial. Ben escorted a valuable witness, literally, to the courtroom. And naturally, it turned out to be a very big story. Ben was in a lot of trouble. His parents were furious. But the guy found his defenders, the sheriff of his hometown, who by this time had figured out who of his subordinates also worked for the bad guys. "You ought to go to the FBI or the CIA, kid," the old sheriff said, and shook Ben's hand in a mature way. Don't scold him too much," the sheriff told his parents. "He did something that not every cop has the guts to do. To think of it, he patched Tom up, took him through some wild places, mixed up his tracks. You'll go far." And himself, by the way, was shy and didn't want the fame. He refused any interviews, didn't take part in the show. And little by little, they got rid of him. And then he moved closer to his brother. And then, anyway, a woman came to him. She'd been beaten by her husband for years. She was afraid to leave him because he had connections, he said. She begged him to help her escape, especially since she was pregnant and afraid he'd take the baby away. Ben helped. He arranged for her to move to a quiet, sleepy little town and arranged everything so that her husband thought she had run away with her lover to Europe in the first place. Then this woman still risked filing for divorce. The child stayed with her, and the scoundrel got a restraining order to come within 100 meters of her. Then something else happened. Ben was approached by the parents of a teenage girl who'd been kidnapped by some cult madman who decided to sacrifice her to the god of chaos. The authorities were looking for her, but they said there was no chance. Because the psychopath had taken the victim into the mountains, Ben wasn't officially allowed to investigate, and he didn't ask for it. He did it all himself. He found the madman and saved the child. In general, Ben didn't plan to deal with such cases. He had enough of his work with wood, construction. But after this case with the rescued girl, the authorities contacted him and offered to become, so to speak, a freelance specialist who could be called upon for help as needed. Now, Ben was called upon when there was a need to escort a person from point A to point B without anyone knowing about it. He consulted on wilderness searches for people and participated in some rescue expeditions himself. And he had one weakness. Sometimes he asked these people for some trifle belonging to them as a souvenir for himself. In general, his, so to speak, official superiors did not approve of this, but Ben in principle trusted, and he could do so. And many people willingly gave him things as souvenirs, because these people were sincerely grateful to him, their savior. And 5 years ago, perhaps one of Ben's most difficult and unusual cases happened. It all started with the fact that a detective who had been working with him for years shared with him some very interesting and unusual information. An investigation was launched into a network of private schools, where rumor had it that they not only taught teenagers and kept them in strict discipline, but also practiced all kinds of abuse on them. Gathering evidence was very difficult. It was extremely difficult to send their people to these institutions under the guise of staff. And then it was decided to try to ask for help from some of the students. Yes, it turned out that it was necessary to involve minors in active and dangerous actions, but there was no other way out. Ben's new assignment was to be a girl named Maggie. He had to pick her up in a small town and then take her to the office of the detective in charge of the case. And at first, it seemed that everything was going according to plan. But Maggie suddenly refused to go anywhere. And in fact, it turned out that another man had already come for her. It was her school acquaintance, Roger. He had been pulled out of school by his father's lawyer, who was also a friend of the family. And now Roger, being of legal age himself, offered Maggie to run away with him to Mexico. And Maggie agreed. She told Ben that she realizes how important her testimony is to the investigation, but she doesn't want to risk her life, because then she would become an enemy to such powerful people. And besides, Maggie just wanted to start a new life after all she had been through. She was very angry at her parents for sending her to this nightmare place. She was convinced that they suspected something about the way she was being treated, but turned a blind eye to it. It turned out that she and Roger had already planned the whole thing. He was ready to arrange everything so that Maggie would be thought to be missing or dead, and then they could start a whole new life in Mexico. Ben was faced with a monstrously difficult choice. For if he agreed with Maggie, then he was betraying the people he was working with. He realized that all of this, it wasn't exactly legal, but Ben agreed to help. He quickly got to know Roger, and the two of them perfected the plan. Ben helped the boys escape through the woods, where Roger's men would pick them up. But Maggie, unfortunately, was inexperienced in the wilderness and fell into some trap set by poachers. She just walked away from the camp into the bushes alone. Although Ben told her not to do that, she bumped her side on a wooden stake, and Ben barely managed to give her first aid. Fortunately, they soon met up with the people Roger's lawyer had helped him hire, and Maggie's life was now safe. And before they parted, Ben asked her to give him the dress. The girl agreed. Ben then pretended he'd lost Maggie. He was believed. And only his brother knew the truth. 4 years went by, 4 years went by, and then the authorities found out the truth. They were ready to bring some charges against Ben, but he was a valuable specialist after all. So they just reprimanded him, especially since they needed his help again. The thing was that, first of all, the trial against these private schools was about to start. They finally had enough evidence and testimonies from former students. And secondly, the detectives began to suspect that the principal of one of the schools in Utah and the maniac attacking girls in many states is the same person. And now they were on his trail. Ben was also helping in his search, but even with all his talents, this thing just seemed elusive. More than 10 victims, young girls. And only recently, according to the detectives, did they get on his trail. And now we could only hope that he would be caught before he sent another victim to the grave. "Your phone's ringing," Matt said to his brother. "Would you at least answer it?" And reluctantly pulled his phone out of his pocket. But when he saw the number, he took the call. It was Detective Larry, with whom they had worked closely over the years, and who had covered for Ben with the authorities after Maggie. "No." "What?" Ben exclaimed. "No. Where is he? What do you mean, stay out of this?" "Larry, you owe it to me to tell me." "No. What's wrong?" Matt asked, but Ben didn't react, just glared. Detective Larry, after a moment's hesitation on the other side, finally gave the approximate coordinates of where the maniac could be. The thing was that only this morning the team of detectives had all the necessary versions, data, and so on, and then someone else became known about a suspicious type who was driving a white van, was reported from a local gas station. This guy was asking a suspicious amount about a local saleswoman, a single mother named Sally, and the owner of the gas station thought it was suspicious. And then the police got a call from another person, a truck driver who first saw a girl jump out and wave her arms at the road, hurriedly voting, and then a strange white van picked her up and drove off in the same direction it had come from. Then the detectives compared the description of the van driver with the approximate portrait of the maniac. In general, Larry assured Ben that the right people had already gone to the supposed area of the villain's location. He assured him that although Ben was a very capable guy, but he should please stay out of the way where the professionals were working, and heard that the girl who got into the van was a blonde in a purple dress and immediately realized that it was his Kate. And now, of course, he couldn't just sit and wait for it to be over. "I'm with you." Matt started to get up from the couch, but immediately sank back down with a groan. He was dizzy. "I'm afraid your fiancé gave me a concussion." "I don't think so." Ben threw open the secret locker in the living room to retrieve his weapon. "You need to go to the hospital." "Okay, I'll call an ambulance," Matt agreed. But are you sure?" "I've never been so sure of anything." Ben said as he ran out the door. "Any last words, doll?" Jim's hot, stinking breath hit Kate's face and she almost threw up. "I'm afraid you'll forget how to talk, not just scream," grinned the maniac. Yes, Kate looked him straight in the eye. She was scared, yes, very scared, but also how much she hated him. She had never realized that it was possible to hate a man so quickly, but it still seemed so natural, after he had confessed all his crimes to her. "I hope you die soon." Her hands were bound in front, and it was this that allowed Kate to suddenly raise them sharply, throwing them forward. The plastic tie caught the cold steel that the maniac was clutching in his right hand, and then Kate drove her hand sharply down and away. Jim gave a confused gasp and dropped the weapon. He wasn't used to his victims fighting back. Usually, they just cried and begged for mercy. He was even more dumbfounded when Kate managed to pull his knee sharply up to his chest, and then, straightening her leg, kicked him hard in the stomach. Jim yelped again, bending in half. "You little bitch. Are you trying to ruin my fun?" He roared and fumbled blindly on the ground, looking for what he had dropped. "You can't always be lucky." Kate exclaimed. "You're going to get caught, you bastard. You think you're special. You're a psycho." "Shut up," shrieked Jim, who suddenly lost his sense of superiority, of boundless power, and even the realization of his own important mission in the world. And all this made him very, very sad, and he was ready to take out all this anger on the obnoxious girl, who stood out from the ranks of his victims so disgustingly, as if deliberately decided to disrupt his pleasure, or get away from her. Kate didn't immediately realize whether the sound was human speech or the growl of a wild animal. But then, turning her head, she saw Ben standing on a low bushy knoll, tense and yet relaxed and dangerous, his legs wide apart, his head tilted forward. "Get away from her." "Who the hell are you?" Jim shrieked, his sweat pouring down in a hail. He was no longer angry, but shocked that his plans had been so disgustingly spoiled. "I'll get you." "Ben," Kate exhaled and sprawled on the ground without strength. It had just ended abruptly, and then she just watched what was happening, and it seemed to her that she was watching a scene from a movie. The girl was not quite aware of reality. She was like an outside observer. She saw how the maniac threw at Ben and how he deftly dodged his attack, and then the maniac just flew to the ground, and then howled when Ben snapped his arm and something crunched, as if a dry branch had broken. And the next moment, armed men in uniforms flew into the clearing. They were special agents and police men. Kate felt so strange. She was ready to faint again, but she found the strength to smile weakly at the guy leaning over her. "I'm here, baby." "How are you? Let's get you out of here." He was already cutting the ties. "No, I'm sorry." "It's okay." "That's wrong." "I guess I was wrong, huh?" Kate whispered. You're a good man, aren't you? You didn't kill my sister," she said. "I didn't ask Mal with certainty. I just don't understand. Her dress, how is it?" "I'll explain," Ben said, and Kate blinked. The image before her eyes was blurring. When she woke up again, she realized she was in a hospital room. The doctor who had greeted her on waking explained that the maniac had knocked her out with a very toxic substance to which she had become allergic, but it had fortunately been neutralized. He also said that she had been in a deep sleep for almost 2 days. "You have visitors," the doctor added. But I would recommend complete rest. Catherine would like to rest too. But she needed the truth even more. And when Ben entered the room, by the way, with a bouquet of flowers, she, as soon as he approached, grabbed his hand tightly. Do you know what happened to Maggie? What's happened to her? It was strange, but it was only when Ben appeared there to rescue her that Catherine suddenly realized in an instant that no, he couldn't be the culprit. And now Ben had told her everything. He had revealed to her the truth about how he had met Maggie and helped her in Roger's escape. He told her about his secret case and apologized for not being able to tell her the truth sooner. Are you crying because I didn't tell you sooner? He asked cautiously. No, Kate sobbed. But Maggie, how could she do this to us, to her family? Mom and Dad, they thought they'd lost her. Actually, I'm sorry, Ben coughed awkwardly. But I can kind of understand it. It's kind of hard to forgive your parents when you're stuck in a place like this. But they didn't know what was going on, Kate ejected stubbornly. I believe that. I wish I did, Ben said, barely audibly. Kate, actually, the detectives will have to talk to you soon, and your words will be very important in the case against that monster. Also, anyway, Ben turned to enter the room, and Kate rounded her eyes, because Maggie was standing on the doorstep. She had changed over the years, tanned, had a short haircut, but it was still the same Maggie. Standing next to her was a tall, also tanned guy. Hello, Maggie said and smiled. Can I come in? Kate, sobbing, could only nod. Ben, saying he didn't want to intrude, left the room. There was so much they needed to talk about. And they did. Maggie told how they live now. Roger's lawyer had managed to get him a decent sum from his father's inheritance, with which they had bought a house in Mexico and opened a small restaurant on the ocean. Maggie has already given birth to 2 children, twin boys, and, as she admitted, waiting for another child. I visited different psychologists, she said, lowering her eyes. I tried to forgive my parents, to understand them. And how? Kate asked quietly. It's not that easy, Maggie sighed. I'm ready. I can meet them. Kate, they ruined my life. I don't think I'll ever be able to treat them the way I used to. But I've managed to let go of that pain, and I can see them. I can communicate with them a little bit. Maggie also revealed that she's here to finally testify fully against Jim as the school principal. You have a wonderful fiancé, Maggie smiled. And actually, he hasn't proposed to me yet, really. What's this then? And her sister pointed to one of the flowers in the bouquet, a scarlet rose with a diamond ring glittering in the center of its bud. Kate, gasping, reached for it. You can put it back and wait for him to ask you, Maggie smiled. Or you can just put it on his finger and he'll see it when he comes back. It's up to you. Just don't you dare say you won't marry him. They talked for a while longer. Kate got to know Roger and recognized that he was a very good-looking guy. Then Maggie left. The doctor says you'll be out in a couple of days, said Ben, who had returned to the room. You'll probably want to go back to your place. Don't worry, there'll be cops outside your house, and they'll put an alarm system in your apartment and... He said, Nah, Ben, Kate said, noticing that he glanced at the bouquet and frowned, because the ring wasn't there. No, it didn't fall off or get lost, he added, taking one hand away from the other so that it was now visible. The ring was on her finger. I'd like to go to your place. If you don't mind, of course. Ben looked at her dumbfounded for a few moments, and then he hugged her. I love you so much, he said. And Kate cried again, this time with happiness. Kate would have liked the next few months to be filled with joy, for she had found the sister she had long thought dead and could love and be loved again. But unfortunately for her, the next few months were filled with the formalities of a double investigation. Jim had been charged for all his victims, and for the deeds he had done at the private school. And at the same time, though it hadn't been an easy time at all, it had all somehow brought Kate closer to her sister and Ben. And then, when it was all over, Maggie and Roger, as well as Kate, had gone to visit the sister's parents. There was a difficult meeting. They talked about a lot of things. Their parents swore that they were unaware of all the nightmares their daughter had to endure. And it seemed to Kate from the outside that Maggie had almost forgiven them. Then Maggie and her husband returned to Mexico. Where are you taking me? Kate asked, because Ben, when she got back to his place, put her in the car and told her he had a surprise for her. If I tell you, it stops being a surprise, he replied. Hey, don't peek, he added sternly when Catherine reached for the blindfold. Whatever you say, she snorted and obeyed. Finally, the car slowed down. Ben helped the bride out of the cabin, holding her gently under the arm and around the waist, because Kate's eyes were still hidden by the blindfold. "It's okay now," he said, taking it off, squinting in the bright midday sun. Kate looked around at the space in front of her with surprised incomprehension. There was a forest in the background, and in front, there was a foundation and some other beginning of construction. "TMG, master. What is this? Did you decide to show off your firm's new project?" "You could say that." Ben grinned. "Look," he pointed with his hand. "Here there will be French windows, and here a veranda, and I also plan." He described the future house colorfully and clearly, and the longer he talked, the more Kate understood that it would be something extraordinary. "Somebody's going to be lucky," she sighed. Actually, Ben told her, leaning in close to her ear. "If you want, you can add to it, change it." "No. Why?" Kate didn't understand. "No, silly girl." He laughed. Because it's your house, our house. I designed it for you and me. I bought the lot. Even includes a piece of woods in that stream over there, more like a rivulet, see? And so I decided that when we get married, we need something completely new and the best." Kate turned to Ben and looked at him wide-eyed. This was such an unexpected, generous gift. She had been preoccupied with other things ever since he had proposed, and she had accepted it. And she hadn't thought much about where they would live after the wedding. But now, looking at what was yet to become home, she realized that it would be the coziest and best place in the world for her, the best home she could ever dream of. "No, thank you," she said, and raised on tiptoe and kissed him. "I have something to say too." What is it?" Ben asked, looking into her beautiful eyes, which had conquered him at first sight. "I think it is absolutely necessary to plant a nursery in the house." Ben froze, and then, picking her up in his arms, spun her around. This was definitely the happiest day of his life, and he knew there would be many more happy days to come.